Tonight, drift into the heart of ancient Greece as Athens and Sparta collide. You're about to experience Book 2 of Thucydides' epic Peloponnesian War, narrated to soothe you into deep relaxation or focused study. But this isn't just a tale of ancient battles. This is the story of two titans. Athens, a beacon of democracy and culture, facing Sparta, a disciplined military powerhouse. What led these mighty city-states, once allies against Persia, to a catastrophic war that reshaped the ancient world forever? And how did a single, devastating plague cripple Athens in ways no enemy ever could? Here, at Luminous Antiquity, we transform the richest chapters of human history into a tranquil journey for your mind. With our soft-spoken narration, gentle ambient sounds, and scientifically tuned visuals, you'll discover history not as a lecture, but as a calming escape, perfect for sleep, study, or mindful reflection. We've curated this experience to ensure every detail supports your relaxation and engagement. If you appreciate diving into history this way, please take a moment to like this video, share your thoughts in the comments below, and subscribe to Luminous Antiquity for more ancient tales to soothe your soul. Chapter 6. The war between the Athenians and Peloponnesians and their respective allies now truly begins. All communication, except through heralds, ceased, and hostilities commenced and were prosecuted without interruption. The history will follow the chronological order of events by summers and winters. The 30 years' truce, established after the conquest of Euboea, lasted 14 years. In the 15th year, in the 48th year of Chrysus's priestess-ship at Argos, in the Ephyrae of Anesias at Sparta, in the second to last month of Pythodorus's archonship at Athens, and 6 months after the Battle of Potidaea, just at the beginning of spring, a Theban force, a little over 300 strong, under the command of their Boeotarchs Pythangelus, son of Phylleides, and Diamperis, son of Onterides, entered Plataea. This town in Boeotia was allied with Athens. Around the first watch of the night, a Plataean named Naucleides, along with his faction, opened the gates to them. Their intention was to execute the citizens of the opposing party, bring the city over to Thebes, and thus gain power for themselves. This had been arranged through Eurymachus, son of Leontiades, a person of great influence at Thebes. Plataea had always been at odds with Thebes, and the latter, foreseeing that war was imminent, wished to surprise her old enemy during peacetime, before hostilities had actually broken out. Indeed, this was how they entered so easily without being observed, as no guard had been posted. After the soldiers had grounded arms in the marketplace, those who had invited them and wished them to begin at once and go to their enemies' houses. However, the Thebans refused to do this. Instead, they decided to issue a conciliatory proclamation, hoping to reach a friendly understanding with the citizens. Their herald accordingly invited any who wished to resume their old place in the confederacy of their countrymen to ground arms with them, for they believed that in this way the city would readily join them. Upon becoming aware of the Thebans' presence within their gates and the sudden occupation of the town, the Plataeans, in their alarm, concluded that more had entered than was actually the case, the night preventing them from seeing clearly. They accordingly came to terms and, accepting the proposal, made no move, especially as the Thebans offered none of them any violence. But somehow, during the negotiations, they discovered the scanty numbers of the Thebans and decided they could easily attack and overpower them, as the majority of the Plataeans were unwilling to revolt from Athens. At all events, they resolved to attempt it. Digging through the party walls of their houses, they managed to join each other without being seen in the streets. In the streets, they placed wagons, without the beasts in them, to serve as a barricade, and arranged everything else as seemed convenient for the occasion. When everything had been done that circumstances permitted, they watched for their opportunity and went out of their houses against the enemy. It was still night, though daybreak was at hand. They believed that in daylight, their attack would be met by courageous men on equal terms with their assailants, while in darkness, it would fall upon panic-stricken troops who would also be at a disadvantage due to their enemy's knowledge of the locality. So they launched their assault at once and engaged in close quarters as quickly as they could. The Thebans, finding themselves outwitted, immediately closed ranks to repel all attacks made upon them. Twice or thrice they beat back their assailants, but the men shouted and charged them, while the women and slaves screamed and yelled from the houses and pelted them with stones and tiles. Besides, it had been raining hard all night, and so, at last, their courage gave way, and they turned and fled through the town. Most of the fugitives were completely ignorant of the correct ways out, and this, along with the mud and the darkness caused by the moon being in her last quarter, and the fact that their pursuers knew their way about and could easily stop their escape, proved fatal to many. The only gate open was the one by which they had entered, and this was shut by one of the Plataeans driving the spike of a javelin into the bar instead of the bolt, so that even here there was no longer any means of exit. They were now chased all over the town. Some got on the wall and threw themselves over, in most cases with a fatal result. One party managed to find a deserted gate and, obtaining an axe from a woman, cut through the bar. But as they were soon observed, only a few succeeded in getting out. Others were cut off in detail in different parts of the city. The most numerous and compact body rushed into a large building next to the city wall. The doors on the street side happened to be open, and the Thebans fancied that they were the gates of the town and that there was a passage straight through to the outside. The Plataeans, seeing their enemies trapped, now consulted whether they should set fire to the building and burn them as they were, or whether there was anything else they could do with them. Until at length, these and the rest of the Theban survivors found wandering about the town agreed to an unconditional surrender of themselves and their arms to the Plataeans. While such was the fate of the party in Plataea, the rest of the Thebans who were to have joined them with all their forces before daybreak, in case of anything miscarrying with the body that had entered, received the news of the affair on the road and pressed forward to their succor. Now, Plataea is nearly 8 miles from Thebes, and their march was delayed by the rain that had fallen in the night, for the river Asopus had risen and was not easy to cross. And so, having to march in the rain and being hindered in crossing the river, they arrived too late and found the whole party either slain or captive. When they learned what had happened, they at once formed a plan against the Plataeans outside the city. As the attack had been made in peacetime and was completely unexpected, there were, of course, men and livestock in the fields. The Thebans wished, if possible, to have some prisoners to exchange for their countrymen in the town, should any chance to have been taken alive. Such was their plan. But the Plataeans suspected their intention almost before it was formed and, becoming alarmed for their fellow citizens outside the town, sent a herald to the Thebans. They reproached them for their unscrupulous attempt to seize their city in peacetime and warned them against any outrage on those outside. Should the warning be disregarded, they threatened to put to death the men they had in their hands, but added that, upon the Thebans retiring from their territory, they would surrender the prisoners to their friends. This is the Theban account of the matter, and they say that they had an oath given to them. The Plataeans, on the other hand, do not admit any promise of an immediate surrender, but make it contingent upon subsequent negotiation. The oath they deny altogether. Be this as it may, upon the Thebans retiring from their territory without committing any injury, the Plataeans hastily brought in whatever they had in the countryside and immediately put the men to death. The prisoners were 180 in number. Eurymachus, the person with whom the traitors had negotiated, being one. This done, the Plataeans sent a messenger to Athens, gave back the dead to the Thebans under a truce, and arranged things in the city as seemed best to meet the present emergency. The Athenians, meanwhile, having had word of the affair sent to them immediately after its occurrence, had instantly seized all the Boeotians in Attica. They sent a herald to the Plataeans to forbid their proceeding to extremities with their Theban prisoners without instructions from Athens. The news of the men's death had, of course, not arrived, the first messenger having left Plataea just when the Thebans entered it, the second just after their defeat and capture, so there was no later news. Thus the Athenians sent orders in ignorance of the facts, and the herald on his arrival found the men slain. After this, the Athenians marched to Plataea, brought in provisions, and left a garrison in the place, also taking away the women and children and such of the men as were least efficient. After the affair at Plataea, the treaty had been broken by an overt act, and Athens at once prepared for war, as did also Lacedaemon and her allies. They resolved to send embassies to the king and to such other of the barbarian powers as either party could look to for assistance, and tried to ally themselves with the independent states at home. Lacedaemon, in addition to her existing navy, gave orders to the states that had declared for her in Italy and Sicily to build vessels up to a grand total of 500, the quota of each city being determined by its size, and also to provide a specified sum of money. Until these were ready, they were to remain neutral and to admit single Athenian ships into their harbors. Athens, on her part, reviewed her existing confederacy and sent embassies to the places more immediately around the Peloponnese, Corcyra, Cephallenia, Acarnania, and Zacynthus, perceiving that if these could be relied on, she could carry the war all around the Peloponnese. And if both sides nourished the boldest hopes and put forth their utmost strength for the war, this was only natural. Zeal is always at its height at the commencement of an undertaking. And on this particular occasion, the Peloponnese and Athens were both full of young men whose inexperience made them eager to take up arms. The rest of Hellas stood straining with excitement at the conflict of its leading cities. Everywhere predictions were being recited and oracles chanted by those who collected them, and this not only in the contending cities. Further, some while before this, there was an earthquake at Delos, for the first time in the memory of the Hellenes. This was said and thought to be ominous of the events impending. Indeed, nothing of the kind that happened was allowed to pass without remark. The good wishes of men greatly favored the Lacedaemonians, especially as they proclaimed themselves the liberators of Hellas. No private or public effort that could help them in speech or action was omitted, each thinking that the cause suffered wherever he could not personally see to it. So general was the indignation felt against Athens, whether by those who wished to escape from her empire or were apprehensive of being absorbed by it. Such were the preparations and such feelings with which the contest opened. The allies of the two belligerents were the following. These were the allies of Lacedaemon, all the Peloponnesians within the isthmus except the Argives and Achaeans, who were neutral. Polonie was the only Achaean city that first joined in the war, though her example was afterwards followed by the rest. Outside the Peloponnese were the Megarians, Locrians, Boeotians, Phocians, Ambraciots, Leucadians, and Anactorians. Of these, ships were furnished by the Corinthians, Megarians, Sicyonians, Pellenians, Hellenes, Ambraciots, and Leucadians, and cavalry by the Boeotians, Phocians, and Locrians. The other states sent infantry. This was the Lacedaemonian confederacy. That of Athens comprised the Chians, Lesbians, Plataeans, the Messenians and Naupactus, most of the Acarnanians, the Corcyrians, Zacynthans, and some tributary cities in the following countries, namely, Caria upon the sea with her Dorian neighbors, Ionia, the Hellespont, the Thracian towns, the islands lying between the Peloponnese and Crete towards the east, and all the Cyclades except Melos and Thera. Of these, ships were furnished by Chios, Lesbos, and Corcyra, infantry and money by the rest. Such were the allies of either party and their resources for the war. Immediately after the affair at Plataea, Lacedaemon sent orders to the cities in the Peloponnese and the rest of her confederacy to prepare troops and the provisions requisite for a foreign campaign in order to invade Attica. The several states were ready at the appointed time and assembled at the isthmus, the contingent of each city being 2/3 of its whole force. After the whole army had mustered, the Lacedaemonian king, Archidamus, the leader of the expedition, called together the generals of all the states and the principal persons and officers, and exhorted them as follows. Peloponnesians and allies, our fathers made many campaigns both within and outside the Peloponnese, and the elder men among us here are not without experience in war. Yet we have never set out with a larger force than the present. And if our numbers and efficiency are remarkable, so also is the power of the state against which we march. We ought not then to show ourselves inferior to our ancestors or unequal to our own reputation. For the hopes and attention of all Hellas are bent upon the present effort, and its sympathy is with the enemy of the hated Athens. Therefore, numerous as the invading army may appear to be, and certain as some may think it, that our adversary will not meet us in the field, this is no sort of justification for the least negligence upon the march. But the officers and men of each particular city should always be prepared for the advent of danger in their own quarters. The course of war cannot be foreseen, and its attacks are generally dictated by the impulse of the moment. And where overweening self-confidence has despised preparation, a wise apprehension has often been able to make headway against superior numbers. Not that confidence is out of place in an army of invasion, but in an enemy's country, it should also be accompanied by the precautions of apprehension. Troops will by this combination be best inspired for dealing a blow and best secured against receiving one. In the present instance, the city against which we are going, far from being so impotent for defense, is on the contrary most excellently equipped at all points, so that we have every reason to expect that they will take the field against us, and that if they have not set out already before we are there, they will certainly do so when they see us in their territory wasting and destroying their property. For men are always exasperated at suffering injuries to which they are not accustomed, and on seeing them inflicted before their very eyes. And where least inclined for reflection, they rush with the greatest heat to action. The Athenians are the very people of all others to do this, as they aspire to rule the rest of the world, and are more in the habit of invading and ravaging their neighbors' territory than of seeing their own treated in the like fashion. Considering, therefore, the power of the state against which we are marching, and the greatness of the reputation which, according to the event, we shall win or lose for our ancestors and ourselves, remember, as you follow where you may be led, to regard discipline and vigilance as of the first importance, and to obey with alacrity the orders transmitted to you. For nothing contributes so much to the credit and safety of an army as the union of large bodies by a single discipline. With this brief speech dismissing the assembly, Archidamus first sent off Melesippus, son of Diacritus, a Spartan, to Athens, in case you should be more inclined to submit upon seeing the Peloponnesians actually on the march. But the Athenians did not admit Melesippus into the city or to their assembly, Pericles having already carried a motion against admitting either herald or embassy from the Lacedaemonians after they had once marched out. The herald was accordingly sent away without an audience and ordered to be beyond the frontier that same day. In the future, if those who sent him had a proposition to make, they must retire to their own territory before they dispatched embassies to Athens. An escort was sent with Melesippus to prevent his holding communication with anyone. When he reached the frontier and was just about to be dismissed, he departed with these words: This day will be the beginning of great misfortunes to the Hellenes. As soon as he arrived at the camp, and Archidamus learned that the Athenians had still no thoughts of submitting, he at length began his march and advanced with his army into their territory. Meanwhile, the Boeotians, sending their contingent and cavalry to join the Peloponnesian expedition, went to Plataea with the remainder and laid waste to the country. While the Peloponnesians were still gathering at the isthmus or marching to invade Attica, Pericles, son of Xanthippus, one of the 10 Athenian generals, realized the invasion was imminent. He considered the possibility that Archidamus, who was his friend, might bypass his estate without plundering it. This could be due to a personal favor, or perhaps Lacedaemonian instructions designed to create suspicion against Pericles, similar to a previous attempt to demand the expulsion of his family. To prevent this, Pericles announced to the Athenian assembly that while Archidamus was his friend, this friendship would not harm the state. He declared that if the enemy spared his houses and lands while ravaging others, he would immediately donate them to public property, ensuring no suspicion would fall upon him. He then reiterated his previous advice to the citizens regarding the war. They were to prepare, bring their property in from the countryside, and not engage in battle, but instead guard the city. Their fleet, he reminded them, was their true strength and should be made ready. They also needed to maintain strict control over their allies, as Athens' power came from their tribute payments. Success in war, he emphasized, depended primarily on good conduct and capital, so there was no reason to despair. Aside from other income, an average of 600 talents of silver came from allied tributes. There were still 6,000 talents of coined silver in the Acropolis, from an original 9,700. The difference had been spent on the Acropolis porch, other public buildings, and the campaign in Potidaea. This sum did not include uncoined gold and silver from public and private offerings, sacred vessels for processions and games, Median spoils, and similar resources, amounting to 500 talents. He also mentioned the treasures of other temples, which were considerable and could legitimately be used. If absolutely necessary, he added, they could even use the gold ornaments of Athena herself, as the statue contained 40 talents of pure gold, all removable. This could be used for self-preservation, but every penny must be restored. Pericles concluded that their financial position was indeed satisfactory. Athens also had an army of 13,000 heavy infantry, with another 16,000 in garrisons and on home duty. This latter group initially consisted of the oldest and youngest levies and resident aliens with heavy armor, stationed as guards during an invasion. The Phaleric Wall stretched 4 miles before joining the city wall, of which nearly 5 miles were guarded, though a section between the Long Wall and the Phaleric remained unguarded. The long walls to Piraeus extended about 4.5 miles, with the outer wall manned. Finally, the circumference of Piraeus with Munichia was almost 7.5 miles, but only half of it was guarded. Pericles further reported that they had 1,200 horsemen, including mounted archers, 1,600 unmounted archers, and 300 galleys ready for service. These were Athens' resources across different departments as the Peloponnesian invasion loomed and hostilities began. Pericles also repeated his usual arguments for expecting a favorable outcome to the war. The Athenians heeded his advice, bringing their wives, children, and all household furniture from the countryside, even dismantling the woodwork of their houses. Their sheep and cattle were sent to Euboea and nearby islands, but they found it difficult to move as most of them had always lived in the country. This had long been more common among Athenians than other peoples. From the time of Cecrops and the first kings down to Theseus, Attica comprised independent townships, each with its own town hall and magistrates. Except in times of danger, the king in Athens was not consulted. In ordinary seasons, they governed themselves and managed their affairs without royal interference. Sometimes, they even waged war against the king, as the Eleusinians did with Eumolpus against Erechtheus. Theseus, however, was a king of equal intelligence and power. A key part of his reforms was to abolish the council chambers and magistrates of the smaller cities, merging them into the single council chamber and town hall of the capital. Individuals retained private property, but were compelled to have only one political center, Athens. Thus, Athens counted all inhabitants of Attica as its citizens, and Theseus left behind a great state. Indeed, the Synoetia, or Feast of Union, which is funded by the state and still celebrated by Athenians in honor of the goddess, dates from his time. Before this, the city consisted of the present citadel and the district beneath it, looking somewhat south. This is evident because the temples of other deities, besides Athena, are in the citadel. Even those outside are mostly located in this quarter of the city, such as the temples of Olympian Zeus, Pythian Apollo, Earth and Dionysus in the marshes, in whose honor the older Dionysia are still celebrated to this day in the month of Anthesterion, not only by Athenians, but also by their Ionian descendants. Other ancient temples also exist in this quarter. The fountain, now called Eniakrinos, or Nine Pipes, since the tyrant's alterations, but originally known as Calero, or Fairwater, was then used for the most important rituals due to its proximity. In fact, the ancient custom of using its water before marriage and for other sacred purposes is still observed. Moreover, due to their long residence in that quarter, the citadel is still known among Athenians simply as the city. Thus, the Athenians long lived scattered across Attica in independent townships. Even after Theseus's centralization, old habits persisted. From early times until the current war, most Athenians still lived in the country with their families and households. Consequently, they were very reluctant to move now, especially as they had only just rebuilt their lives after the Median invasion. Their distress and discontent were profound as they abandoned their homes and the ancestral temples of their ancient way of life, forced to change their habits and bid farewell to what each considered his native city. When they arrived in Athens, a few had their own houses or could find refuge with friends or relatives. However, the vast majority had to settle in undeveloped parts of the city, in temples and hero chapels, excluding the Acropolis and the temple of Eleusinian Demeter, and other places that were always kept closed. The occupation of the plot of ground below the citadel, called the Pelasgian, had been forbidden by a curse. An ominous fragment of a Pythian oracle also stated, "Leave the Pelasgian parcel desolate. Woe is worth the day that men inhabit it." Yet, even this area was now built over out of immediate necessity. And in my opinion, if the oracle proved true, it was in the opposite sense to what was expected. For the state's misfortunes did not arise from the unlawful occupation, but the necessity of the occupation arose from the war. Though the god did not mention this, he foresaw that it would be an evil day for Athens when the plot came to be inhabited. Many also took quarters in the wall towers or wherever else they could. When everyone arrived, the city proved too small to hold them, though they later divided the long walls and a large part of Piraeus into lots and settled there. All this while, great attention was given to the war. Allies were mustered, and an armament of 100 ships was equipped for the Peloponnese. Such was the state of preparation in Athens. Meanwhile, the Peloponnesian army advanced. The first town they reached in Attica was Eno, where they intended to enter the country. They laid siege to it, preparing to assault the wall with engines and other means. Eno, situated on the Athenian and Boeotian border, was a walled town used as a fortress by the Athenians in wartime. So, the Peloponnesians prepared for their assault, wasting valuable time before the place. This delay brought severe censure upon Archidamus. Even during the war's levy, he was criticized for weakness and Athenian sympathies due to his half-measures. After the army assembled, he further damaged his public standing by lingering at the isthmus and the slowness of the rest of the march. But all this was nothing compared to the delay at Eno. During this interval, the Athenians were bringing in their property, and the Peloponnesians believed a swift advance would have caught everything still outside, had it not been for Archidamus's procrastination. Such was the army's feeling towards Archidamus during the siege. But he, it is said, expected the Athenians would shrink from letting their land be wasted and would submit while it was still unharmed, which is why he waited. But after he had assaulted Eno, and every attempt to take it failed, and no herald came from Athens, he finally broke camp and invaded Attica. This was about 80 days after the Theban attempt on Plataea, right in the middle of summer when the corn was ripe, with Archidamus, son of Zeuxis, king of Lacedaemon, in command. Encamping in Eleusis and the Thriasian plain, they began their ravages. After putting some Athenian horsemen to flight at a place called Rhydi, or the Brooks, they then advanced, keeping Mount Aegaleus on their right, through Cropia until they reached Acharni, the largest of the Athenian demes or townships. They established a camp there and continued their ravages for a long time. The reason Archidamus remained in battle formation at Acharni during this incursion, instead of descending into the plain, is said to have been this. He hoped the Athenians might be tempted by the multitude of their youth and the unprecedented efficiency of their service to come out to battle and try to stop the devastation of their lands. Accordingly, since they had met him at Eleusis or the Thriasian plain, he tried to provoke them to a sally by the site of a camp at Acharni. He thought the place itself was a good position for encamping, and it seemed likely that such an important part of the state as the 3,000 heavy infantry of the Acharnians would refuse to submit to the ruin of their property and would force a battle on the rest of the citizens. On the other hand, if the Athenians did not take the field during this incursion, he could then fearlessly ravage the plain in future invasions and extend his advance up to the very walls of Athens. After the Acharnians had lost their own property, they would be less willing to risk themselves for that of their neighbors, thus creating division in Athenian councils. These were Archidamus's motives for remaining at Acharni. Meanwhile, as long as the army was at Eleusis and the Thriasian plain, hopes were still entertained that it would not advance any closer. It was remembered that Pleistoanax, son of Pausanias, king of Lacedaemon, had invaded Attica with a Peloponnesian army 14 years before, but had retreated without advancing farther than Eleusis and Phrygia. This indeed caused his exile from Sparta, as it was thought he had been bribed to retreat. But when they saw the army at Acharni, barely 7 miles from Athens, they lost all patience. The territory of Athens was being ravaged before their very eyes, a sight the young men had never seen before in the old only in the Median Wars. It was naturally considered a grievous insult, and the determination was universal, especially among the young men, to sally forth and stop it. Groups formed in the streets, engaged in heated discussion. For if the proposed sally was warmly recommended, it was also in some cases opposed. Oracles of various interpretations were recited by collectors and found eager listeners among the disputants. Foremost in pressing for the sally were the Acharnians, as they constituted a significant portion of the state's army, and it was their land that was being ravaged. In short, the whole city was in a most excited state. Pericles was the object of general indignation. His previous counsels were completely forgotten. He was criticized for not leading out the army he commanded and was held responsible for all the public suffering. Pericles, meanwhile, seeing anger and infatuation now ascendant and understanding the wisdom of refusing a sally, would not call either an assembly or a meeting of the people. He feared the fatal results of a debate inspired by passion rather than prudence. Accordingly, he focused on the city's defense, keeping it as quiet as possible, though he constantly sent out cavalry to prevent enemy raiding parties from attacking lands near the city. There was a minor skirmish at Phrygia between a squadron of Athenian horsemen with the Thessalians and the Boeotian cavalry. The former initially had the advantage until the heavy infantry advanced to support the Boeotians, at which point the Thessalians and Athenians were routed and lost a few men. Their bodies, however, were recovered the same day without a truce. The next day, the Peloponnesians set up a trophy. Ancient alliance brought the Thessalians to Athens' aid. Those who came included the Larisseans, Pharsalians, Crenonians, Pyrasians, Tertonians, and Phrygians. The Larissean commanders were Polymedes and Aristonus, two-party leaders in Larissa. The Pharsalian general was Menon, and each of the other cities also had its own commander. In the meantime, as the Athenians did not come out to engage them, the Peloponnesians left Acharni and ravaged some of the demes between Mount Parnes and Brilessus. While they were in Attica, the Athenians dispatched the 100 ships they had been preparing to sail around the Peloponnese, carrying 1,000 heavy infantry and 400 archers, under the command of Carcinus, son of Xenotimus, Proteas, son of Epicles, and Socrates, son of Anagenes. This armament weighed anchor and began its cruise. The Peloponnesians, after remaining in Attica as long as their provisions lasted, retired through Boeotia by a different road than the one they had entered. As they passed Oropus, they ravaged the territory of Greea, which the Oropians held from Athens, and then returned to their respective cities in the Peloponnese. After the Peloponnesians retired, the Athenians set up land and sea guards at points where they intended to have regular stations during the war. They also resolved to set aside a special fund of 1,000 talents from the money in the Acropolis. This fund was not to be spent. The current expenses of the war were to be provided for otherwise. If anyone should propose or vote for using this money for any purpose other than defending the city in the event of an enemy fleet attacking by sea, it would be a capital offense. With this sum, they also set aside a special fleet of 100 galleys, the best ships of each year, with their captains. None of these were to be used except with this money and against the same peril, should such peril arise. Meanwhile, the Athenians, with their 100 ships around the Peloponnese, reinforced by a Corcyraean squadron of 50 vessels and other allied ships in those waters, cruised along the coasts, ravaging the countryside. Among other places, they landed in Laconia and assaulted Methone, a town with no garrison and weak walls. However, Brasidas, son of Tellus, a Spartan, was in command of a guard for the district's defense. Hearing of the attack, he rushed with 100 heavy infantry to the besieged aid. Dashing through the scattered Athenian forces, whose attention was fixed on the wall, he threw himself into Methone. He lost a few men entering, but saved the place and earned Sparta's thanks for his exploit, becoming the first officer to receive such notice during the war. The Athenians immediately weighed anchor and continued their cruise. Touching at Phia in Elis, they ravaged the country for 2 days and defeated a picked force of 300 men who had come from the Vale of Elis and the immediate neighborhood to the rescue. But a stiff squall descended upon them, and, disliking to face it in a place with no harbor, most of them boarded their ships. Doubling Point Ichthys, they sailed into the port of Phia. In the meantime, the Messenians and others who could not get on board marched overland and captured Phia. The fleet later sailed around to pick them up and then put to sea. Phia was evacuated as the main army of the Hellenes had now arrived. The Athenians continued their cruise, ravaging other coastal areas. Around the same time, the Athenians sent 30 ships to cruise around Locris and guard Euboea, under the command of Cleopampus, son of Clinias. Making descent from the fleet, he ravaged certain coastal areas, captured Thronium, and took hostages from it. He also defeated the Locrians who had assembled to resist him at Alope. During the summer, the Athenians also expelled the Aeginetans, with their wives and children, from Aegina. This was on the grounds that they had been the chief instigators of the war. Besides, Aegina lay so close to the Peloponnese that it seemed safer to send their own colonists to hold it, and shortly afterward, settlers were sent out. The banished Aeginetans found asylum in Thyrea, which Lacedaemon granted them, not only because of its quarrel with Athens, but also because the Aeginetans had put Lacedaemon under obligation at the time of the earthquake and the Helot revolt. The territory of Thyrea is on the frontier of Argolis and Laconia, reaching down to the sea. Those Aeginetans who did not settle there were scattered throughout the rest of Hellas. The same summer, at the beginning of a new lunar month, the sun was eclipsed afternoon. After assuming the form of a crescent and some stars had appeared, it returned to its natural shape. During the same summer, Nymphodorus, son of Pythes and Abderite, whose sister Cydelses had married, was made their proxenus by the Athenians and sent to Athens. They had previously considered him an enemy, but he had great influence with Cydelses, and they wished this prince to become their ally. Cydelses was the son of Teres and king of the Thracians. Teres, Cydelses' father, was the first to establish the great kingdom of the Odrysians on a scale quite unknown to the rest of Thrace, a large portion of the Thracians being independent. This Teres is in no way related to Tyrus, who married Pandion's daughter Procne from Athens, nor indeed did they belong to the same part of Thrace. Tyrus lived in Daulis, part of what is now called Phocis, but which at that time was inhabited by Thracians. It was in this land that the women perpetrated the outrage upon Ichis, and many poets, when they mention the nightingale, call it the Daulian bird. Besides, Pandion, in contracting an alliance for his daughter, would consider the advantages of mutual assistance and would naturally prefer a match at the above moderate distance to the journey of many days which separates Athens from the Odrysians. Again, the names are different, and this Teres was king of the Odrysians, the first, by the way, who attained any power. Cydelses, his son, was now sought as an ally by the Athenians, who desired his aid in the reduction of the Thracian towns and of Perdiccas. Coming to Athens, Nymphodorus concluded the alliance with Cydelses, made his son Saticus an Athenian citizen, and promised to end the war in Thrace by persuading Cydelses to send the Athenians a force of Thracian horse and targeteers. He also reconciled them with Perdiccas and induced them to restore Therme to him. Upon this, Perdiccas at once joined the Athenians and Phormio in an expedition against the Chalcidians. Thus, Cydelses, son of Teres, king of the Thracians, and Perdiccas, son of Alexander, king of the Macedonians, became allies of Athens. Meanwhile, the Athenians in the 100 vessels were still cruising around the Peloponnese. After taking Salium, a town belonging to Corinth, and presenting the city and territory to the Acarnanians of Polera, they stormed Astacus, expelled its tyrant Evarchus, and gained the place for their confederacy. Next, they sailed to the island of Cephallenia and brought it over without using force. Cephallenia lies off Acarnania and Lucas and consists of 4 states: the Palians, Cranians, Samians, and Pernians. Not long afterward, the fleet returned to Athens. Towards the autumn of this year, the Athenians invaded the Megarid with their entire levy, including resident aliens, under the command of Pericles, son of Xanthippus. The Athenians and the 100 ships around the Peloponnese, on their journey home, had just reached Aegina. Hearing that their fellow citizens were in full force at Megara, they now sailed over and joined them. This was, without doubt, the largest army of Athenians ever assembled, the state being still in the flower of its strength and not yet visited by the plague. 10,000 heavy infantry were in the field, all Athenian citizens, in addition to the 3,000 already at Potidaea. Then the resident aliens who joined the incursion were at least 3,000 strong, besides a multitude of light troops. They ravaged the greater part of the territory and then retired. Other incursions into the Megarid were afterwards made annually by the Athenians during the war, sometimes only with cavalry, sometimes with all their forces. This continued until the capture of Nicaea. Atlanta, the uninhabited island off the Opuntian coast, was also converted into a fortified post by the Athenians towards the end of this summer to prevent privateers issuing from Opus and the rest of Locris from plundering Euboea. Such were the events of this summer after the return of the Peloponnesians from Attica. In the ensuing winter, the Acarnanian of Varchus, wishing to return to Astacus, persuaded the Corinthians to sail over with 40 ships and 1,500 heavy infantry to restore him, also hiring some mercenaries himself. In command of the force were Euphamidas, son of Aristonomus, Timoxenus, son of Timocrates, and Eumachus, son of Chrysis, who sailed over and restored him. After failing in an attempt on some places on the Acarnanian coast they wished to gain, they began their voyage home. Coasting along the shore, they touched at Cephallenia and made a descent on the Cranian territory. Losing some men due to the treachery of the Cranians, who suddenly attacked them after agreeing to negotiate, they put to sea somewhat hurriedly and returned home. In the same winter, the Athenians held a public funeral for those who had first fallen in this war. It was a custom of their ancestors, and the manner of it is as follows. 3 days before the ceremony, the bones of the dead are laid out in an erected tent, and their friends bring offerings to their relatives as they please. In the funeral procession, cypress coffins are carried on carts, one for each tribe, with the bones of the deceased placed in the coffin of their tribe. Among these is carried one empty bier, decorated for the missing, those whose bodies could not be recovered. Any citizen or stranger who wishes joins the procession, and the female relatives are there to wail at the burial. The dead are laid in the public sepulchre in the beautiful suburb of the city, where those who fall in war are always buried, with the exception of those slain at Marathon, who for their singular and extraordinary valor were interred on the spot where they fell. After the bodies have been laid in the earth, a man chosen by the state, of approved wisdom and eminent reputation, pronounces an appropriate eulogy over them, after which all retire. Such is the manner of the burying, and throughout the whole of the war, whenever the occasion arose, the established custom was observed. Meanwhile, these were the first to have fallen, and Pericles, son of Xanthippus, was chosen to pronounce their eulogy. When the proper time arrived, he advanced from the sepulchre to an elevated platform to be heard by as many of the crowd as possible, and spoke as follows. Most of my predecessors in this place have commended the one who made this speech part of the law, telling us that it is well that it should be delivered at the burial of those who fall in battle. For myself, I would have thought that the worth displayed in deeds would be sufficiently rewarded by honors also shown by deeds, such as you now see in this funeral prepared at the people's cost. And I could have wished that the reputations of many brave men were not to be imperiled by a single individual, to stand or fall according to how well or poorly he spoke. For it is hard to speak properly on a subject where it is even difficult to convince your hearers that you are speaking the truth. On the one hand, a friend familiar with every fact of the story may think that some point has not been set forth with the fullness he wishes and knows it deserves. On the other hand, a stranger to the matter may be led by envy to suspect exaggeration if he hears anything beyond his own experience. For men can endure to hear others praised only as long as they can persuade themselves of their own ability to equal the actions recounted. When this point is passed, envy comes in, and with it, incredulity. However, since our ancestors have approved this custom, it becomes my duty to obey the law and try to satisfy your various wishes and opinions as best I may. I shall begin with our ancestors. It is both just and proper that they should have the honor of the first mention on an occasion like the present. They dwelt in this country without interruption from generation to generation, and handed it down free to the present time by their valor. And if our more remote ancestors deserve praise, much more do our own fathers, who added to their inheritance the empire we now possess, and spared no pains to be able to leave their acquisitions to us of the present generation. Lastly, there are few parts of our dominions that have not been augmented by those of us here who are still more or less in the vigor of life, while the mother country has been furnished by us with everything that can enable her to depend on her own resources, whether for war or for peace. That part of our history which tells of the military achievements that gave us our various possessions, or of the ready valor with which either we or our fathers stemmed the tide of Hellenic or foreign aggression, is a theme too familiar to my hearers for me to elaborate on, and I shall therefore pass it by. But what was the path by which we reached our position? What form of government allowed our greatness to grow? What national habits did it spring from? These are questions I may try to answer before I proceed to my eulogy upon these men, since I think this to be a subject on which, on the present occasion, a speaker may properly dwell, and to which the whole assembly, whether citizens or foreigners, may listen with advantage. Our Constitution does not copy the laws of neighboring states. We are rather a pattern to others than imitators ourselves. Its administration favors the many instead of the few. This is why it is called a democracy. If we look at the laws, they afford equal justice to all in their private differences. Regarding social standing, advancement in public life is based on reputation for capacity, with class considerations not interfering with merit. Nor does poverty bar the way. If a man is able to serve the state, he is not hindered by the obscurity of his condition. The freedom we enjoy in our government extends also to our ordinary life. There, far from exercising jealous surveillance over each other, we do not feel called upon to be angry with our neighbor for doing what he likes, or even to indulge in those injurious looks which cannot fail to be offensive, although they inflict no positive penalty. But all this ease in our private relations does not make us lawless as citizens. Against this, fear is our chief safeguard, teaching us to obey the magistrates and the laws, particularly such as regard the protection of the injured, whether they are actually on the statute book or belong to that code, which, although unwritten, yet cannot be broken without acknowledged disgrace. Furthermore, we provide plenty of means for the mind to refresh itself from business. We celebrate games and sacrifices all year round, and the elegance of our private establishments forms a daily source of pleasure and helps to banish melancholy. Meanwhile, the magnitude of our city draws the produce of the world into our harbor, so that to the Athenian, the fruits of other countries are as familiar a luxury as those of his own. If we turn to our military policy, there also we differ from our antagonists. We throw open our city to the world and never, by alien acts, exclude foreigners from any opportunity of learning or observing, although the eyes of an enemy may occasionally profit by our liberality. We trust less in system and policy than in the native spirit of our citizens. In education, where our rivals, from their very cradles, seek manliness through painful discipline, at Athens we live exactly as we please, and yet are just as ready to encounter every legitimate danger. As proof of this, it may be noted that the Lacedaemonians do not invade our country alone, but bring with them all their confederates, while we Athenians advance unsupported into the territory of a neighbor, and fighting on foreign soil, usually vanquish with ease men who are defending their homes. Our united force was never yet encountered by any enemy because we have to attend to our marine and to dispatch our citizens by land on 100 different services, so that, wherever they engage with some fraction of our strength, a success against a detachment is magnified into a victory over the nation, and a defeat into a reverse suffered at the hands of our entire people. And yet, if with habits not of labor but of ease, and courage not of art but of nature, we are still willing to encounter danger, we have the double advantage of escaping the experience of hardships in anticipation and of facing them in the hour of need as fearlessly as those who are never free from them. Nor are these the only points in which our city is worthy of admiration. We cultivate refinement without extravagance and knowledge without effeminacy. We employ wealth more for use than for show, and consider the real disgrace of poverty not in admitting the fact, but in declining the struggle against it. Our public men, besides politics, have their private affairs to attend to, and our ordinary citizens, though occupied with industry, are still fair judges of public matters. For unlike any other nation, we Athenians regard him who takes no part in these duties not as unambitious but as useless. We are able to judge, even if we cannot originate, and instead of looking at discussion as a stumbling block to action, we think it an indispensable prerequisite to any wise action at all. Again, in our enterprises, we present this singular spectacle of daring and deliberation, each carried to its highest point, and both united in the same persons. Usually, decision is the fruit of ignorance, and hesitation of reflection. But the prize for courage will surely be most justly awarded to those who best know the difference between hardship and pleasure, and yet are never tempted to shrink from danger. In generosity, we are equally unique, acquiring our friends by conferring, not by receiving favors. Yet, of course, the giver of the favor is the firmer friend of the two, seeking by continued kindness to keep the recipient in his debt, while the debtor feels less keenly, conscious that his return will be a payment, not a free gift. And it is only the Athenians who, fearless of consequences, confer their benefits not from calculations of expediency, but in the confidence of liberality. In short, I say that as a city, we are the school of Hellas. I doubt if the world can produce a man who, where he has only himself to depend upon, is equal to so many emergencies and graced by such happy versatility as the Athenian, and that this is no mere boast thrown out for the occasion, but plain matter of fact, the power of the state, acquired by these habits, proves. For Athens alone of her contemporaries is found, when tested, to be greater than her reputation. Alone, she gives no occasion to her assailants to blush at the antagonist by whom they have been worsted, or to her subject to question her right to rule based on merit. Rather, the admiration of the present and succeeding ages will be ours, since we have not left our power without witness, but have shown it by mighty proofs. Far from needing a Homer for our eulogist, or others of his craft whose verses might charm for the moment only for the impression they gave to melt at the touch of fact, we have forced every sea and land to be the highway of our daring, and everywhere, whether for evil or for good, have left imperishable monuments behind us. Such is the Athens for which these men, asserting their resolve not to lose her, nobly fought and died, and well may every one of their survivors be ready to suffer in her cause. Indeed, if I have dwelt at some length upon the character of our country, it has been to show that our stake in this struggle is not the same as theirs who have no such blessings to lose, and also that the eulogy of the men over whom I am now speaking might be established by definite proofs. That eulogy is now in a great measure complete, for the Athens I have celebrated is only what the heroism of these and their like have made her, men whose fame, unlike that of most Hellenes, will be found to be only commensurate with their deserts. And if a test of worth be wanted, it is to be found in their closing scene, and this not only in cases where it set the final seal upon their merit, but also in those where it gave the first intimation of their having any. For there is justice in the claim that steadfastness in his country's battles should be as a cloak to cover a man's other imperfections, since the good action has blotted out the bad, and his merit as a citizen more than outweighed his demerits as an individual. But none of these allowed either wealth, with its prospect of future enjoyment, to unnerve his spirit, or poverty, with its hope of a day of freedom and riches, to tempt him to shrink from danger. No, holding that vengeance upon their enemies was more to be desired than any personal blessings, and reckoning this to be the most glorious of hazards, they joyfully determined to accept the risk, to make sure of their vengeance, and to let their wishes wait. And while committing to hope the uncertainty of final success, in the business before them, they thought fit to act boldly and trust in themselves, thus choosing to die resisting, rather than to live submitting. They fled only from dishonor, but met danger face to face, and after one brief moment, while at the summit of their fortune, escaped, not from their fear, but from their glory. So these men died and became Athenians. You, their survivors, must determine to have as unfaltering a resolution in the field, though you may pray that it may have a happier outcome. And not content with ideas derived only from words about the advantages linked to the defense of your country, though these would furnish a valuable text to a speaker even before an audience so alive to them as the present. You must yourselves realize the power of Athens. Feed your eyes upon her from day to day, until love overfills your hearts. And then, when all her greatness breaks upon you, you must reflect that it was by courage, a sense of duty, and a keen feeling of honor and action that men were enabled to win all this, and that no personal failure in an enterprise could make them consent to deprive their country of their valor. Rather, they laid it at her feet as the most glorious contribution they could offer. For this offering of their lives, made in common by them all, each of them individually received that renown which never grows old. And for a sepulchre, not so much that in which their bones have been deposited, but that noblest of shrines wherein their glory is laid up to be eternally remembered upon every occasion on which deed or story shall call for its commemoration. For heroes have the whole earth for their tomb, and in lands far from their own, where the column with its epitaph declares it, there is enshrined in every breast an unwritten record, with no tablet to preserve it, except that of the heart. Take these as your model, and, judging happiness to be the fruit of freedom and freedom of valor, never decline the dangers of war. For it is not the miserable who would most justly be unsparing of their lives. These have nothing to hope for. It is rather those to whom continued life may bring reverses as yet unknown, and to whom a fall, if it came, would be most tremendous in its consequences. And surely, to a man of spirit, the degradation of cowardice must be immeasurably more grievous than the unfelt death which strikes him in the midst of his strength and patriotism. Comfort, therefore, not condolence, is what I have to offer to the parents of the dead who may be here. Numberless are the chances to which, as they know, the life of man is subject. But fortunate indeed are they who draw for their lot a death so glorious as that which has caused your mourning, and to whom life has been so exactly measured as to terminate in the happiness in which it has been passed. Still, I know that this is a hard saying, especially when those are in question of whom you will constantly be reminded by seeing in the homes of others blessings of which you once boasted. For grief is felt not so much for the want of what we have never known, as for the loss of that to which we have been long accustomed. Yet you who are still of an age to beget children must bear up in the hope of having others in their stead. Not only will they help you to forget those whom you have lost, but will be to the state at once a reinforcement and a security. For never can a fair or just policy be expected of the citizen who does not, like his fellows, bring to the decision the interests and apprehensions of a father. While those of you who have passed your prime must congratulate yourselves with the thought that the best part of your life was fortunate, and that the brief span that remains will be cheered by the fame of the departed. For it is only the love of honor that never grows old, and honor it is, not gain, as some would have it, that rejoices the heart of age and helplessness. Turning to the sons or brothers of the dead, I see an arduous struggle before you. When a man is gone, all are wont to praise him, and should your merit be ever so transcendent, you will still find it difficult not merely to overtake, but even to approach their renown. The living have envy to contend with, while those who are no longer in our path are honored with a goodwill into which rivalry does not enter. On the other hand, if I must say anything on the subject of female excellence to those of you who will now be in widowhood, it will be all comprised in this brief exhortation. Great will be your glory in not falling short of her natural character, and greatest will be hers who is least talked of among the men, whether for good or for bad. My task is now finished. I have performed it to the best of my ability, and in word at least, the requirements of the law are now satisfied. If deeds are in question, Those who are interred here have received part of their honors already, and for the rest, their children will be brought up until manhood at public expense. The state thus offers a valuable prize as the garland of victory in this race of valor, for the reward both of those who have fallen and their survivors. And where the rewards for merit are greatest, there are found the best citizens. And now that you have brought to a close your lamentations for your relatives, you may depart. Chapter 7. Such was the funeral that took place during this winter, with which the first year of the war came to an end. In the first days of summer, the Lacedaemonians and their allies, with 2/3 of their forces as before, invaded Attica under the command of Archidamus, son of Zosidamus, king of Lacedaemon. They settled down and laid waste to the countryside. Not many days after their arrival in Attica, the plague first began to show itself among the Athenians. It was said that it had previously broken out in many places near Lemnos and elsewhere, but a pestilence of such extent and mortality was nowhere remembered. Neither were the physicians at first of any service, ignorant as they were of the proper way to treat it. Instead, they died most thickly themselves as they visited the sick most often, nor did any human art succeed any better. Supplications in the temples, divinations, and so forth were found equally futile until the overwhelming nature of the disaster at last put a stop to them altogether. It first began, it is said, in the parts of Ethiopia above Egypt, and then descended into Egypt, Libya, and most of the king's country. Suddenly falling upon Athens, it first attacked the population in Piraeus, which caused them to say that the Peloponnesians had poisoned the reservoirs, there being as yet no wells there, and afterward appeared in the upper city, where the deaths became much more frequent. All speculation as to its origin and its causes, if causes can be found adequate to produce so great a disturbance, I leave to other writers, whether lay or professional. For myself, I shall simply set down its nature and explain the symptoms by which perhaps it may be recognized by the student, if it should ever break out again. This I can do better, as I had the disease myself and watched its operation in the case of others. That year, then, is admitted to have been otherwise unprecedentedly free from sickness, and such few cases as occurred all ended in this plague. As a rule, however, there was no obvious cause, but people in good health were all of a sudden attacked by violent heats in the head and redness and inflammation in the eyes. The inward parts, such as the throat or tongue, became bloody and emitted an unnatural and fetid breath. These symptoms were followed by sneezing and hoarseness, after which the pain soon reached the chest and produced a hard cough. When it settled in the stomach, it upset it, and discharges of bile of every kind named by physicians ensued, accompanied by very great distress. In most cases, an ineffectual retching followed, producing violent spasms, which in some cases ceased soon after, in others much later. Externally, the body was not very hot to the touch, nor pale in its appearance, but reddish, livid, and breaking out into small pustules and ulcers. But internally, it burned so that the patient could not bear to have on him clothing or linen, even of the very lightest description, or indeed to be anything other than stark naked. What they would have liked best would have been to throw themselves into cold water, as indeed was done by some of the neglected sick, who plunged into the rain tanks in their agonies of unquenchable thirst, though it made no difference whether they drank little or much. Besides this, the miserable feeling of not being able to rest or sleep never ceased to torment them. The body, meanwhile, did not waste away as long as the distemper was at its height, but held out remarkably against its ravages, so that when they succumbed, as in most cases on the 7th or 8th day, to the internal inflammation, they still had some strength in them. But if they passed this stage and the disease descended further into the bowels, inducing a violent ulceration there accompanied by severe diarrhea, this brought on a weakness which was generally fatal. For the disorder first settled in the head, ran its course from thence through the whole body, and, even where it did not prove mortal, it still left its mark on the extremities. for it settled in the privy parts, the fingers, and the toes, and many escaped with the loss of these, some too with that of their eyes. Others again were seized with an entire loss of memory on their first recovery, and did not know either themselves or their friends. But while the nature of the distemper was such as to baffle all description, and its attacks almost too grievous for human nature to endure, it was still in the following circumstance that its difference from all ordinary disorders was most clearly shown. All the birds and beasts that prey upon human bodies either abstained from touching them, though there were many lying unburied, or died after tasting them. In proof of this, it was noticed that birds of this kind actually disappeared. They were not about the bodies, or indeed to be seen at all. But of course, the effects which I have mentioned could best be studied in a domestic animal like the dog. Such then, if we pass over the varieties of particular cases, which were many and peculiar, were the general features of the distemper. Meanwhile, the town enjoyed an immunity from all the ordinary disorders, or if any case occurred, it ended in this. Some died in neglect, others in the midst of every attention. No remedy was found that could be used as a specific, for what did good in one case, did harm in another. Strong and weak constitutions proved equally incapable of resistance, all alike being swept away, although dieted with the utmost precaution. By far the most terrible feature in a malady was the dejection which ensued when anyone felt himself sickening, for the despair into which they instantly fell took away their power of resistance and left them a much easier prey to the disorder. Besides which, there was the awful spectacle of men dying like sheep, having caught the infection and nursing each other. This caused the greatest mortality. On the one hand, if they were afraid to visit each other, they perished from neglect. Indeed, many houses were emptied of their inmates for want of nurse. On the other hand, if they ventured to do so, death was the consequence. This was especially the case with those who made any pretensions to goodness. Honor made them unsparing of themselves and their attendants in their friends' houses, where even the members of the family were at last worn out by the moans of the dying and succumbed to the force of the disaster. It was with those who had recovered from the disease that the sick and the dying found most compassion. They knew what it was from experience and had no fear for themselves, for the same man was never attacked twice, never at least fatally. And such persons not only received the congratulations of others, but themselves also, in the elation of the moment, half entertained the vain hope that they were for the future safe from any disease whatsoever. An aggravation of the existing calamity was the influx from the country into the city, and this was especially felt by the new arrivals. As there were no houses to receive them, they had to be lodged, in the hot season of the year, in stifling cabins, where the mortality raged without restraint. The bodies of dying men lay one upon another, and half-dead creatures reeled about the streets and gathered around all the fountains in their longing for water. The sacred places also, in which they had quartered themselves, were full of corpses of persons that had died there, just as they were. For as the disaster passed all bounds, men, not knowing what was to become of them, became utterly careless of everything, whether sacred or profane. All the burial rites previously in use were entirely upset, and they buried the bodies as best they could. Many, for want of the proper appliances, and through so many of their friends having died already, resorted to the most shameless burials. Sometimes getting the start of those who had raised a pyre, they threw their own dead body upon the stranger's pyre and ignited it. Sometimes they tossed the corpse they were carrying on top of another that was burning, and so went off. Nor was this the only form of lawless extravagance which owed its origin to the plague. Men now coolly ventured on what they had formerly done in a corner, and not just as they pleased, seeing the rapid transitions produced by persons in prosperity suddenly dying and those who before had nothing succeeding to their property. So they resolved to spend quickly and enjoy themselves, regarding their lives and riches as similar things of a day. Perseverance in what men called honor was popular with none. It was so uncertain whether they would be spared to attain the object. But it was settled that present enjoyment, and all that contributed to it, was both honorable and useful. Fear of gods or law of man, there was none to restrain them. As for the first, they judged it to be just the same whether they worshipped them or not, as they saw all alike perishing. And for the last, no one expected to live to be brought to trial for his offenses, but each felt that a far more severe sentence had been already passed upon them all and hung ever over their heads. Before this fell, it was only reasonable to enjoy life a little. Such was the nature of the calamity, and heavily did it weigh on the Athenians, death raging within the city and devastation without. Among other things which they remembered in their distress was, very naturally, the following verse which the old men said had long ago been uttered. A Dorian war shall come, and with it death. So a dispute arose as to whether dearth and not death had been the word in the verse. But at the present juncture, it was of course decided in favor of the latter, for the people made their recollection fit in with their sufferings. I fancy, however, that if another Dorian war should ever afterwards come upon us, and a dearth should happen to accompany it, the verse will probably be read accordingly. The oracle which had been given to the Lacedaemonians was also now remembered by those who knew of it. When the god was asked whether they should go to war, he answered that if they put their might into it, victory would be theirs, and that he would himself be with them. With this oracle, events were supposed to tally. For the plague broke out as soon as the Peloponnesians invaded Attica, and never entering Peloponnese, not at least to an extent worth noticing, committed its worst ravages at Athens, and next to Athens, at the most populous of the other towns. Such was the history of the plague. After ravaging the plain, the Peloponnesians advanced into the Paralian region as far as Laurium, where the Athenian silver mines are, and first laid waste on the side looking towards Peloponnese, next that which faces Euboea and Andrus. But Pericles, who was still general, held the same opinion as in the former invasion and would not let the Athenians march out against them. However, while they were still in the plain and had not yet entered the Paralian land, he had prepared an armament of 100 ships for the Peloponnese. When all was ready, he went out to sea. On board the ships, he took 4,000 Athenian heavy infantry and 300 cavalry and horse transports, which were then made for the first time out of old galleys. 50 Chian and Lesbian vessels also joined the expedition. When this Athenian armament was put out to sea, they left the Peloponnesians in Attica in the Paralian region. Arriving at Epidaurus in the Peloponnese, they ravaged most of the territory and even had hopes of taking the town by assault. In this, however, they were not successful. Putting out from Epidaurus, they laid waste the territory of Treason, Haliais, and Hermione, all towns on the coast of Peloponnese. From there, sailing to Praesia, a maritime town in Laconia, they ravaged part of its territory and took and sacked the place itself, after which they returned home, but found the Peloponnesians gone and no longer in Attica. During the whole time that the Peloponnesians were in Attica and the Athenians on the expedition in their ships, men kept dying of the plague both in the armament and in Athens. Indeed, it was actually asserted that the departure of the Peloponnesians was hastened by fear of the disorder, as they heard from deserters that it was in the city and also could see the burials going on. Yet in this invasion, they remained longer than in any other and ravaged the whole country, for they were about 40 days in Attica. The same summer, Hagnon, son of Nicias, and Cleopampus, son of Clinias, Pericles' colleagues, took the armament of which he had lately made use and went off on an expedition against the Chalcidians in the direction of Thrace and Potidæa, which was still under siege. As soon as they arrived, they brought up their engines against Potidæa and tried every means of taking it, but did not succeed either in capturing the city or in doing anything else worthy of their preparations. For the plague attacked them here also and committed such havoc as to cripple them completely. Even the previously healthy soldiers of the former expedition caught the infection from Hagnon's troops, while Phormio and the 1,600 men whom he commanded only escaped by being no longer in the neighborhood of the Chalcidians. The end of it was that Hagnon returned with his ships to Athens, having lost 1,050 out of 4,000 heavy infantry in about 40 days, though the soldiers stationed there before remained in the country and carried on the siege of Potidaea. After the second invasion of the Peloponnesians, a change came over the spirit of the Athenians. Their land had now been twice laid waste, and war and pestilence at once pressed heavily upon them. They began to find fault with Pericles as the author of the war and the cause of all their misfortunes, and became eager to come to terms with Lacedaemon, and actually sent ambassadors thither, who did not, however, succeed in their mission. Their despair was now complete, and all vented itself upon Pericles. When he saw them exasperated at the present turn of affairs, and acting exactly as he had anticipated, he called an assembly, being, it must be remembered, still general, with the double object of restoring confidence, and of leading them from these angry feelings to a calmer and more hopeful state of mind. He accordingly came forward and spoke as follows. I was not unprepared for the indignation of which I have been the object, as I know its causes, and I have called an assembly for the purpose of reminding you upon certain points, and of protesting against your being unreasonably irritated with me, or cowed by your sufferings. I am of the opinion that national greatness is more for the advantage of private citizens than any individual well-being coupled with public humiliation. A man may be personally ever so well off, and yet if his country be ruined, he must be ruined with it, whereas a flourishing commonwealth always affords chances of salvation to unfortunate individuals. Since then a state can support the misfortunes of private citizens, while they cannot support hers, it is surely the duty of everyone to be forward in her defense, and not, like you, to be so confounded with your domestic afflictions as to give up all thoughts of the common safety, and to blame me for having counseled war, and yourselves for having voted it. And yet, if you are angry with me, it is with one who, as I believe, is second to no man either in knowledge of the proper policy or in the ability to expound it, and who is, moreover, not only a patriot but an honest one. A man possessing that knowledge without that faculty of exposition might as well have no idea at all on the matter. If he had both these gifts, but no love for his country, he would be but a cold advocate for her interests, while were his patriotism not proof against bribery, everything would go for a price. So if you thought that I was even moderately distinguished for these qualities when you took my advice and went to war, there is certainly no reason now why I should be charged with having done wrong. For those, of course, who have a free choice in the matter and whose fortunes are not at stake, war is the greatest of follies. But if the only choice is between submission with loss of independence and danger with the hope of preserving that independence, then it is he who will not accept the risk that deserves blame, not he who will. I am the same man and do not change. It is you who change. For in fact, you took my advice while unhurt and waited for misfortune to repent of it. The apparent error of my policy lies in the weakness of your resolve, since the suffering it entails is being felt by everyone among you, while its advantage is still remote and obscure to all. A great and sudden reverse has befallen you, and your mind is too depressed to persevere in your resolve. For before what is sudden, unexpected, and least within calculation, the spirit quails. And putting all else aside, the plague has certainly been an emergency of this kind. Born, however, as you are, citizens of a great state, and brought up with habits equal to your birth, you should be ready to face the greatest disasters and still keep unimpaired the luster of your name. For the judgment of mankind is as relentless towards the weakness that falls short of recognized renown, as it is jealous of the arrogance that aspires higher than its due. Cease then to grieve for your private afflictions, and address yourselves instead to the safety of the commonwealth. If you shrink before the exertions which the war what makes necessary, and fear that after all they may not have a happy result. You know the reasons by which I have often demonstrated to you the groundlessness of your apprehensions. If those are not enough, I will now reveal an advantage arising from the greatness of your dominion, which I think has never yet suggested itself to you, which I never mentioned in my previous speeches, and which is so bold a sound that I should scarcely venture it now, were it not for the unnatural depression I see around me. You perhaps think that your empire extends only over your allies. I will declare to you the truth. The visible field of action has two parts, land and sea. In the whole of one of these, you are completely supreme, not merely as far as you use it at present, but also to what further extent you may think fit. In short, your naval resources are such that your vessels may go where they please, without the king or any other nation on earth being able to stop them. So that although you may think it a great privation to lose the use of your land and houses, still you must see that this power is something widely different. Instead of fretting on their account, you should really regard them as the gardens and other accessories that embellish a great fortune, and as, in comparison, of little moments. You should know, too, that liberty preserved by your efforts will easily recover for us what we have lost, while the knee once bowed, even what you have will pass from you. Your fathers, receiving these possessions not from others, but from themselves, did not let slip what their labor had acquired, but delivered them safely to you. In this respect, at least, you must prove yourselves their equals, remembering that to lose what one has got is more disgraceful than to be balked at getting. You must confront your enemies not merely with spirit, but with disdain. Confidence, indeed, a blissful ignorance can impart, even to a coward's breast, but disdain is the privilege of those who, like us, have been assured by reflection of their superiority to their adversary. And where the chances are the same, knowledge fortifies courage by the contempt which is its consequence, its trust being placed not in hope, which is the prop of the desperate, but in a judgment grounded upon existing resources, whose anticipations are more to be depended upon. Again, your country has a right to your services in sustaining the glories of her position. These are a common source of pride to you all, and you cannot decline the burdens of empire and still expect to share its honors. You should remember also that what you are fighting against is not merely slavery as an exchange for independence, but also loss of empire and danger from the animosities incurred in its exercise. Besides, to recede is no longer possible, if indeed any of you, in the alarm of the moment, has become enamored of the honesty of such an unambitious part. For what you hold is, to speak somewhat plainly, a tyranny. To take it perhaps was wrong, but to let it go is unsafe. And men of these retiring views, making converts of others, would quickly ruin a state. Indeed, the result would be the same if they could live independently by themselves, for the retiring and unambitious are never secure without vigorous protectors at their side. In fine, such qualities are useless to an imperial city, though they may help a dependency to an unmolested servitude. But you must not be seduced by citizens like these, or angry with me. If I voted for war, only did as you did yourselves, in spite of the enemy having invaded your country and done what you could be certain he would do if you refused to comply with his demands. And although, besides what we counted for, the plague has come upon us, the only point indeed at which our calculation has been at fault. It is this, I know, that has had a large share in making me more unpopular than I should otherwise have been, quite undeservedly, unless you are also prepared to give me the credit of any success with which chance may present you. Besides, the hand of heaven must be borne with resignation, that of the enemy with fortitude. This was the old way at Athens, and do not you prevent it being so still. Remember, too, that if your country has the greatest name in all the world, it is because she never bent before disaster, because she has expended more life and effort in war than any other city, and has won for herself a power greater than any hitherto known, the memory of which will descend to the latest posterity. Even if now, in obedience to the general law of decay, we should ever be forced to yield. Still, it will be remembered that we held rule over more Hellenes than any other Hellenic state, that we sustained the greatest wars against their united or separate powers, and inhabited a city unrivaled by any other in resources or magnitude. These glories may incur the censure of the slow and unambitious. From the breast of energy they will awaken emulation, and in those who must remain without them, an envious regret. Hatred and unpopularity at the moment have fallen to the lot of all who have aspired to rule others. But where odium must be incurred, true wisdom incurs it for the highest objects. Hatred also is short-lived, but that which makes the splendor of the present and the glory of the future remains forever unforgotten. Make your decision, therefore, for glory then and honor now, and attain both objects by instant and zealous effort. Do not send heralds to Lacedaemon, and do not betray any sign of being oppressed by your present sufferings, since they whose minds are least sensitive to calamity, and whose hands are most quick to meet it, are the greatest men and the greatest communities. Such were the arguments by which Pericles tried to cure the Athenians of their anger against him, and to divert their thoughts from their immediate afflictions. As a community, he succeeded in convincing them. They not only gave up all ideas of sending to Lacedaemon, but applied themselves with increased energy to the war. Still, as private individuals, they could not help smarting under their sufferings. The common people had been deprived of the little that they possessed, while the higher orders had lost fine properties with costly establishments and buildings in the country, and, worst of all, had war instead of peace. In fact, the public feeling against him did not subside until he had been fined. Not long afterwards, however, according to the way of the multitude, they again elected him general and committed all their affairs to his hands. Having now become less sensitive to their private and domestic afflictions, and understanding that he was the best man of all for the public necessities. For as long as he was at the head of the state during the peace, he pursued a moderate and conservative policy, and in his time, its greatness was at its height. When the war broke out, here also he seems to have rightly gauged the power of his country. He outlived its commencement by 2 years and 6 months, and the correctness of his previsions respecting it became better known by his death. He told them to wait quietly, to pay attention to their marine, to attempt no new conquests, and to expose the city to no hazards during the war. And doing this promised them a favorable result. What they did was the very contrary, allowing private ambitions and private interests, in matters apparently quite foreign to the war, to lead them into projects unjust both to themselves and to their allies, projects whose success would only conduce to the honor and advantage of private persons, and whose failure entailed certain disaster on the country in the war. The causes of this are not far to seek. Pericles, indeed, by his rank, ability, and known integrity, was enabled to exercise an independent control over the multitude, in short, to lead them instead of being led by them. For as he never sought power by improper means, he was never compelled to flatter them, but, on the contrary, enjoyed so high an estimation that he could afford to anger them by contradiction. Whenever he saw them unseasonably and insolently elated, he would with a word reduce them to alarm. On the other hand, if they fell victims to a panic, he could at once restore them to confidence. In short, what was nominally a democracy became in his hands government by the first citizen. With his successors, it was different, more on a level with one another, and each grasping its supremacy, they ended by even committing the conduct of state affairs to the whims of the multitude. This, as might have been expected in a great and sovereign state, produced a host of blunders, and amongst them the Sicilian expedition. Though this failed not so much through a miscalculation of the power of those against whom it was sent, as through a fault in the senders in not taking the best measures afterwards to assist those who had gone out, but choosing rather to occupy themselves with private cabals for the leadership of the commons, by which they not only paralyzed operations in the field, but also first introduced civil discord at home. Yet after losing most of their fleet besides other forces in Sicily, and with faction already dominant in the city, they could still for 3 years make head against their original adversaries, joined not only by the Sicilians, but also by their own allies, nearly all in revolt, and at last by the king's son, Cyrus, who furnished the funds for the Peloponnesian navy. Nor did they finally succumb until they fell the victims of their own internal disorders. So superfluously abundant were the resources from which the genius of Pericles foresaw an easy triumph in the war over the unaided forces of the Peloponnesians. During the same summer, the Lacedaemonians and their allies made an expedition with 100 ships against Zacynthus, an island lying off the coast of Elis, populated by a colony of Achaeans from Peloponnese and in alliance with Athens. There were 1,000 Lacedaemonian heavy infantry on board, and Nemus, a Spartan, as admiral. They made a descent from their ships and ravaged most of the country. But as the inhabitants would not submit, they sailed back home. At the end of the same summer, the Corinthian Aristeus, Anaristus, Nicholas, and Stratodemus, envoys from Lacedaemon, Timagoras, a Tegean, and a private individual named Paulus from Argos, on their way to Asia to persuade the king to supply funds and join in the war, came to Cydalus, son of Teres in Thrace. Their idea was to induce him, if possible, to forsake the alliance of Athens and to march on Potidaea, then besieged by an Athenian force, and also to get conveyed by his means to their destination across the Hellespont to Pharnabazus, who was to send them up the country to the king. But there chanced to be with Cydalus some Athenian ambassadors, Lurchus, son of Callimachus, and Ameniades, son of Philemon, who persuaded Cydalus' son, Sadicus, the new Athenian citizen, to put the men into their hands and thus prevent their crossing over to the king and doing their part to injure the country of his choice. He accordingly had them seized, as they were traveling through Thrace to the vessel in which they were to cross the Hellespont, by a party whom he had sent on with Lurchus and Ameniades, and gave orders for their delivery to the Athenian ambassadors, by whom they were brought to Athens. On their arrival, the Athenians, afraid that Aristeus, who had been notably the prime mover in the previous affairs of Potidaea and their Thracian possessions, might live to do them still more mischief if he escaped, slew them all the same day, without giving them a trial or hearing the defense which they wished to offer, and cast their bodies into a pit. They thought themselves justified in using in retaliation the same mode of warfare which the Lacedaemonians had begun, when they slew and cast into pits all the Athenian and allied traders whom they caught on board the merchantmen around Peloponnese. Indeed, at the outset of the war, the Lacedaemonians butchered as enemies all whom they took on the sea, whether allies of Athens or neutrals. About the same time, towards the close of the summer, the Ambraciote forces, with a number of barbarians that they had raised, marched against the Amphilochian Argos and the rest of that country. The origin of their enmity against the Argives was this. This Argos and the rest of Amphilochia were colonized by Amphilochus, son of Amphiaraus. Dissatisfied with the state of affairs at home on his return either after the Trojan War, he built this city in the Ambracian Gulf and named it Argos after his own country. This was the largest town in Amphilochia, and its inhabitants the most powerful. Under the pressure of misfortune many generations afterwards, they called in the Ambraciotes, their neighbors on the Amphilochian border, to join their colony. It was by this union with the Ambraciotes that they learned their present Hellenic speech, the rest of the Amphilochians being barbarians. After a time, the Ambraciotes expelled the Argives and held the city themselves. Upon this, the Amphilochians gave themselves over to the Acarnanians, and the two together called the Athenians, who sent them Phormio as general and 30 ships. Upon whose arrival they took Argos by storm, and made slaves of the Ambraciotes, and the Amphilochians and Acarnanians inhabited the town in common. After this began the alliance between the Athenians and Acarnanians. The enmity of the Ambraciotes against the Argives thus commenced with the enslavement of their citizens, and afterwards during the war, They collected this armament among themselves and the Chaonians and other of the neighboring barbarians. Arriving before Argos, they became masters of the country, but not being successful in their attacks upon the town, returned home and dispersed among their different peoples. Such were the events of the summer. The ensuing winter, the Athenians sent 20 ships around Peloponnese under the command of Phormio, who stationed himself at Naupactus and kept watch against anyone sailing in or out of Corinth and the Crissaean Gulf. 6 other ships went to Caria and Lycia under Melissander to collect tribute in those parts, and also to prevent Peloponnesian privateers from taking up station in those waters and molesting the passage of merchantmen from Phaselis and Phoenicia and the adjoining continent. However, Melissander, going up the country into Lycia with a force of Athenians from the ships and their allies, was defeated and killed in battle, with the loss of a number of his troops. The same winter, the Potidæans at length found themselves no longer able to hold out against their besiegers. The Peloponnesian incursions into Attica had not had the desired effect of making the Athenians raise the siege. Provisions there were none left, and so far had distress for food gone in Potidæa that, besides a number of other horrors, instances had even occurred of people having eaten one another. In this extremity, they at last made proposals for capitulating to the Athenian generals in command against them. Xenophon, son of Euripides, Hestiodorus, son of Aristoclides, and Phonomachus, son of Callimachus. The generals accepted their proposals, seeing the sufferings of the army in so exposed a position, besides which the state had already spent 2,000 talents upon the siege. The terms of the capitulation were as follows: a free passage out for themselves, their children, wives, and auxiliaries with 1 garment apiece, the women with 2, and a fixed sum of money for their journey. Under this treaty, they went out to Chalcidice and other places according to their means. The Athenians, however, blamed the generals for granting terms without instructions from home, being of the opinion that the place would have had to surrender unconditionally. They afterwards sent settlers of their own to Potidæa and colonized it. Such were the events of the winter, and so ended the second year of this war, of which Thucydides was the historian. Chapter 8. The next summer, instead of invading Attica, the Peloponnesians and their allies marched against Plataea under the command of Archidamus, son of Zosidamus, king of the Lacedaemonians. He had encamped his army and was about to lay waste the country, when the Plataeans hastened to send envoys to him, who spoke as follows: Archidamus and Lacedaemonians, in invading Plataean territory, you do what is wrong in itself, and worthy neither of yourselves nor of the fathers who begot you. Pausanias, son of Cleombrotus, your countryman, after freeing Hellas from the Medes with the help of those Hellenes who were willing to undertake the risk of the battle fought near our city, offered sacrifice to Zeus the Liberator in the marketplace of Plataea. Calling all the allies together, he restored to the Plataeans their city and territory, and declared it independent and inviolate against aggression or conquest. Should any such be attempted, the allies present were to help according to their power. Your fathers rewarded us thus for the courage and patriotism that we displayed at that perilous epoch. But you do just the contrary, coming with our bitterest enemies, the Thebans, to enslave us. We appeal, therefore, to the gods to whom the oaths were then made, to the gods of your ancestors, and lastly to those of our country, and call upon you to refrain from violating our territory or transgressing the oaths, and to let us live independent, as Pausanias decreed. The Plataeans had gotten thus far when they were cut short by Archidamus, who said, There is justice, Plataeans, in what you say, if you act up to your words. According to the grant of Pausanias, continue to be independent yourselves, and join in freeing those of your fellow countrymen who, after sharing in the perils of that period, joined in the oaths to you, and are now subject to the Athenians. For it is to free them and the rest that all this provision and war has been made. I could wish that you would share our labors and abide by the oaths yourselves. If this is impossible, Do what we have already required of you. Remain neutral, enjoying your own. Join neither side, but receive both as friends, neither as allies for the war. With this we shall be satisfied. Such were the words of Archidamus. The Plataeans, after hearing what he had to say, went into the city and acquainted the people with what had passed, and presently returned for answer that it was impossible for them to do what he proposed without consulting the Athenians, with whom their children and wives now were. Besides which, they had their fears for the town. After his departure, what was to prevent the Athenians from coming and taking out of their hands, or the Thebans, who would be included in the oaths, from taking advantage of the proposed neutrality to make a second attempt to seize the city? Upon these points, he tried to reassure them by saying, "You have only to deliver over the city and houses to us Lacedaemonians, to point out the boundaries of your land, the number of your fruit trees, and whatever else can be numerically stated, and yourselves to withdraw wherever you like as long as the war shall last. When it is over, we will restore to you whatever we received, and in the interim hold it in trust and keep it in cultivation, paying you a sufficient allowance." When they had heard what he had to say, they re-entered the city, and after consulting with the people said that they wished first to acquaint the Athenians with this proposal, and in the event of their approving, to accede to it. In the meantime, they asked him to grant them a truce and not to lay waste their territory. He accordingly granted a truce for the number of days requisite for the journey, and meanwhile abstained from ravaging their territory. The Plataean envoys went to Athens and consulted with the Athenians, and returned with the following message to those in the city. The Athenians say, Plataeans, that they never hitherto, since we became their allies, on any occasion abandoned us to an enemy, nor will they now neglect us, but will help us according to their ability, and they adjure you by the oaths which your fathers swore, to keep the alliance unaltered. On the delivery of this message by the envoys, the Plataeans resolved not to be unfaithful to the Athenians, but to endure, if it must be, seeing their lands laid waste, and any other trials that might come to them, and not to send out again, but to answer from the wall that it was impossible for them to do as the Lacedaemonians proposed. As soon as he had received this answer, King Archidamus proceeded first to make a solemn appeal to the gods and heroes of the country in words following. You gods and heroes of the Plataean territory, be my witnesses that not as aggressors originally, nor until these had first departed from the common oath, did we invade this land, in which our fathers offered you their prayers before defeating the Medes, in which you made auspicious to the Hellenic arms, nor shall we be aggressors in them, measures to which we may now resort, since we have made many fair proposals, but have not been successful. Graciously accord that those who were the first to offend may be punished for it, and that vengeance may be attained by those who would righteously inflict it. After this appeal to the gods, Archidamus put his army in motion. First, he enclosed the town with a palisade formed of the fruit trees which they cut down to prevent further egress from Plataea. Next, they threw up a mound against the city, hoping that the largeness of the force employed would ensure the speedy reduction of the place. They accordingly cut down timber from Cytheron and built it up on either side, laying it like lattice work to serve as a wall to keep the mound from spreading abroad, and carried to it wood and stones and earth, and whatever other material might help to complete it. They continued to work at the mound for 70 days and nights without intermission, being divided into relief parties to allow for some being employed in carrying, while others took sleep and refreshment. The Lacedaemonian officer attached to each contingent, keeping the men to the work. But the Plataeans, observing the progress of the mound, constructed a wall of wood and fixed it upon that part of the city wall against which the mound was being erected, and built up bricks inside it which they took from the neighboring houses. The timbers served to bind the building together, and to prevent its becoming weak as it advanced in height. It had also a covering of skins and hides, which protected the woodwork against the attacks of burning missiles and allowed the men to work in safety. Thus the wall was raised to a great height, and the mound opposite made no less rapid progress. The Plataeans also thought of another expedient. They pulled out part of the wall upon which the mound abutted and carried the earth into the city. Discovering this, the Peloponnesians twisted up clay in wattles of reed and threw it into the breach formed in the mound, in order to give it consistency and prevent its being carried away like the soil. Stopped in this way, the Plataeans changed their mode of operation and dug a mine from the town, calculated their way under the mound, and began to carry off its material as before. This went on for a long while without the enemy outside finding it out, so that for all they threw on the top, their mound made no progress in proportion, being carried away from beneath and constantly settling down in the vacuum. But the Plataeans, fearing that even thus they might not be able to hold out against the superior numbers of the enemy, had yet another invention. They stopped working at the large building in front of the mound, and starting at either end of it inside from the old low wall, built a new one in the form of a crescent running in towards the town, in order that in the event of the great wall being taken this might remain, and the enemy have to throw up a fresh mound against it, and as they advance within might not only have their trouble over again, but also be exposed to missiles on their flanks. While raising the mound, the Peloponnesians also brought up engines against the city, one of which was brought up upon the mound against the great building and shook down a good piece of it, to the no small alarm of the Plataeans. Others were advanced against different parts of the wall, but were lassoed and broken by the Plataeans, who also hung up great beams by long iron chains from either extremity of two poles laid on the wall and projecting over it, and drew them up at an angle whenever any point was threatened by the engine, and loosing their hold let the beam go with its chains slack, so that it fell with a run and snapped off the nose of the battering ram. After this, the Peloponnesians, finding that their engines effected nothing, and that their mound was met by the counterwork, concluded that their present means of offense were unequal to the taking of the city, and prepared for its circumvallation. First, however, they determined to try the effects of fire and see whether they could not, with the help of a wind, burn the town, as it was not a large one. Indeed, they thought of every possible expedient by which the place might be reduced without the expense of a blockade. They accordingly brought faggots of brushwood and threw them from the mound, first into the space between it and the wall. This soon becoming full from the number of hands at work, they next heaped the faggots up as far into the town as they could reach from the top, and then lighted the wood by setting fire to it with sulfur and pitch. The consequence was a fire greater than anyone had ever yet seen produced by human agency, though it could not of course be compared to the spontaneous conflagrations sometimes known to occur through the wind rubbing the branches of a mountain forest together. And this fire was not only remarkable for its magnitude, but was also, at the end of so many perils, within an ace of proving fatal to the Plataeans. A great part of the town became entirely inaccessible, and had a wind blown upon it, in accordance with the hopes of the enemy, nothing could have saved them. As it was, there is also a story of heavy rain and thunder having come on by which the fire was put out and the danger averted. Failing in this last attempt, the Peloponnesians left a portion of their forces on the spot, dismissing the rest, and built a wall of circumvallation around the town, dividing the ground among the various cities present, a ditch being made within and without the lines from which they got their bricks. All being finished by about the rising of Arcturus, they left enough men to man half the wall, the rest being manned by the Boeotians, and drawing off their army dispersed to their several cities. The Plataeans had before sent off their wives and children and oldest men and the mass of the non-combatants to Athens, so that the number of the besieged left in the place comprised 400 of their own citizens, 80 Athenians, and 110 women to bake their bread. This was the sum total at the commencement of the siege, and there was no one else within the walls, bond or free. Such were the arrangements made for the blockade of Plataea. The same summer, and simultaneously with the expedition against Plataea, the Athenians marched with 2,000 heavy infantry and 200 horse against the Chalcidians in the direction of Thrace and the Bottians, just as the corn was getting ripe, under the command of Xenophon, son of Euripides, with 2 colleagues. Arriving before Spartolus in Bottiaea, they destroyed the corn and had some hopes of the city coming over through the intrigues of a faction within. But those of a different way of thinking had been sent to Olynthus, and a garrison of heavy infantry and other troops arrived accordingly. These issuing from Spartolus were engaged by the Athenians in front of the town. The Chalcidian heavy infantry, and some auxiliaries with them, were beaten and retreated into Spartolus. But the Chalcidian horse and light troops defeated the horse and light troops of the Athenians. The Chalcidians had already a few targeteers from Crusis, and presently after the battle were joined by some others from Olynthus. Upon seeing them, the light troops from Spartolus, emboldened by this accession and by their previous success, with the help of the Chalcidian horse and the reinforcement just arrived, again attacked the Athenians, who retired upon the 2 divisions which they had left with their baggage. Whenever the Athenians advanced, their adversary gave way, pressing them with missiles the instant they began to retire. The Chalcidian horse also, riding up and charging them just as they pleased, at last caused a panic amongst them and routed and pursued them to a great distance. The Athenians took refuge in Potidaea, and afterwards recovered their dead under truce, and returned to Athens with a remnant of their army, 430 men, and all the generals having fallen. The Chalcidians and Bottiaeans set up a trophy, took up their dead, and dispersed to their several cities. The same summer, not long after this, the Ambraciots and Chaonians, being desirous of reducing the whole of Acarnania and detaching it from Athens, persuaded the Lacedaemonians to equip a fleet from their confederacy and sent 1,000 heavy infantry to Acarnania. They represented that, if a combined movement were made by land and sea, the coast Acarnanians would be unable to march, and the conquest of Zacynthus and Cephallenia easily following on the possession of Acarnania. The cruise around Peloponnese would be no longer so convenient for the Athenians. Besides which, there was a hope of taking Naupactus. The Lacedaemonians accordingly at once sent off a few vessels with Nemus, who was still high admiral, and the heavy infantry on board, and sent around orders for the fleet to equip as quickly as possible and sail to Leucas. The Corinthians were the most forward in the business, the Ambraciots being a colony of theirs, while the ships from Corinth, Sicyon, and the neighborhood were getting ready, and those from Leucas, Anactorium, and Ambracia, which had arrived before, were waiting for them at Leucas. Nemus and his 1,000 heavy infantry had run into the Gulf, giving the slip to Phormio, the commander of the Athenian squadron stationed off Naupactus, and began at once to prepare for the land expedition. The Hellenic troops with him consisted of the Ambraciots, Leucadians, and Anactorians, and 1,000 Peloponnesians with whom he came. The barbarians consisted of 1,000 Chaonians, who, belonging to a nation that has no king, were led by Phades and Nicanor, the 2 members of the royal family, to whom the chieftainship for that year had been confided. With the Chaonians came also some Thesprotians, like them without a king, some Molossians and Adantanians led by Sabalinthus, the guardian of King Therips, who was still a minor, and some Paravians, under their king Aretus, accompanied by 1,000 Orestians, subjects of King Antiochus, and placed by him under the command of Aretus. There were also 1,000 Macedonians sent by Perdiccas without the knowledge of the Athenians, but they arrived too late. With this force, Nemus set out, without waiting for the fleet from Corinth. Passing through the territory of Amphilochian Argos, and sacking the open village of Limnaea, they advanced to Stratus, the Acarnanian capital. This once taken, the rest of the country, they felt convinced, would speedily follow. The Acarnanians, finding themselves invaded by a large army by land, and from the sea threatened by a hostile fleet, made no combined attempt at resistance, but remained to defend their homes, and sent for help to Phormio, who replied that, when a fleet was on the point of sailing from Corinth, it was impossible for him to leave Naupactus unprotected. The Peloponnesians, meanwhile, and their allies advanced upon Stratus in 3 divisions, with the intention of encamping near it and attempting the wall by force if they failed to succeed by negotiation. The order of march was as follows. The center was occupied by the Chaonians and the rest of the barbarians, with the Leucadians and Anactorians and their followers on the right, and Nemus with the Peloponnesians and Ambraciots on the left, each division being a long way off from, and sometimes even out of sight of, the others. The Hellenes advanced in good order, keeping a lookout till they encamped in a good position, but the Chaonians, filled with self-confidence, and having the highest character for courage among the tribes of that part of the continent, without waiting to occupy their camp, rushed on with the rest of the barbarians, in the idea that they should take the town by assault and obtain the sole glory of the enterprise. While they were coming on, the Stratians, becoming aware how things stood, and thinking that the defeat of this division would considerably dishearten the Hellenes behind it, occupied the environs of the town with ambuscades, and as soon as they approached, engaged them at close quarters from the city and the ambuscades. A panic seizing the Chaonians, great numbers of them were slain, and as soon as they were seen to give way, the rest of the barbarians turned and fled. Owing to the distance by which their allies had preceded them, neither of the Hellenic divisions knew anything of the battle, but fancied they were hastening on to encamp. However, when the flying barbarians broke in upon them, they opened their ranks to receive them, brought their divisions together, and stopped quiet where they were for the day. The Stratians did not offer to engage them, as the rest of the Acarnanians had not yet arrived, but content themselves with slinging at them from a distance, which distressed them greatly, as there was no stirring without their armor. The Acarnanians would seem to excel in this mode of warfare. As soon as night fell, Nemus hastily withdrew his army to the Anapus River, about 9 miles from Stratus. The next day, under a truce, they recovered their dead. After being joined by their allies from Eniade, they retreated to that city before enemy reinforcements could arrive. From there, each force returned home. The Stratians then set up a trophy commemorating their victory over the barbarians. Meanwhile, a fleet from Corinth and other allied forces in the Crissaean Gulf was meant to support Nemus and prevent the coastal Acarnanians from joining their countrymen inland. However, this fleet was unable to do so because, at the same time as the battle at Stratus, they were forced to fight Phormio and his 20 Athenian ships stationed at Naupactus. Phormio had been watching the Peloponnesian fleet as it sailed out of the Gulf, hoping to attack them in the open sea. But the Corinthians and their allies had set out for Acarnania with no intention of a naval battle. Their vessels were more like transports for soldiers, and they never imagined that 20 Athenian ships would dare to engage their 47. As the Peloponnesians sailed along their own coast, the Athenians paralleled their course. When the Peloponnesians attempted to cross from Patrae in Achaea to the mainland on the other side, heading for Acarnania, they again saw the Athenians emerging from Chalcis and the Ivenus River to intercept them. The Peloponnesians slipped their moorings during the night, but they were spotted and eventually forced into battle in mid-passage. Each state contributing to the Peloponnesian armament had its own general. The Corinthian commanders were Macan, Isocrates, and Agatharchidas. The Peloponnesians arranged their vessels in the largest possible circle, leaving no opening, with their prows facing outward and sterns inward. Inside this formation, they placed all their smaller craft and 5 of their best sailing ships, ready to quickly sally out and reinforce any point threatened by the enemy. The Athenians, formed in a line, sailed round and round the Peloponnesian circle, forcing them to contract their formation. They continually brushed past, feigning attacks, but Phormio had previously cautioned them not to engage until he gave the signal. He hoped the Peloponnesians would not maintain their order like a land army. He expected their ships to collide and their small craft to cause confusion. He also anticipated a wind rising from the Gulf, which typically occurred toward morning, and kept sailing in circles, waiting for it. He was confident that once the wind came, the the Peloponnesians would not remain steady for an instant. Phormio also believed he could attack whenever he pleased, as his ships were faster, and that an attack timed with the arrival of the wind would be most effective. When the wind finally swept down, the enemy ships were already tightly packed. Between the wind and the smaller craft crashing into them, they immediately fell into disarray. Ship collided with ship, crews pushed them apart with poles, and their shouts, curses, and struggles with one another made captains' orders and boatswains' cries inaudible. Unable to properly clear their oars in the rough water due to lack of practice, they prevented their vessels from obeying their helmsman. At this moment, Phormio gave the signal, and the Athenians attacked. They first sank one of the admiral's ships, then disabled every vessel they encountered. In the ensuing confusion, no one considered resistance. Instead, they fled towards Patrae and Dyme in Achaea. The Athenians gave chase, captured 12 ships, and after removing most of the men, sailed to Malicrium. After setting up a trophy on the promontory of Rhium and dedicating a ship to Poseidon, they returned to Naupactus. As for the Peloponnesians, they immediately sailed with their remaining ships along the coast from Dyme and Patrae to Cyllene, the Ilian naval base. There, Nemus and the ships from Leucas, which were supposed to have joined them, also arrived after the battle at Stratus. The Lacedaemonians then dispatched 3 commissioners, Timocrates, Bratidas, and Lycophron, to Nemus and the fleet, with orders to prepare to engage again with better fortune, and not to be driven from the sea by a few vessels. They could not at all comprehend their defeat, especially since it was their first attempt at sea. They imagined it was not that their navy was inferior, but that there had been misconduct somewhere. They did not consider the Athenians' long experience compared to their own limited practice. The commissioners were, therefore, sent in anger. As soon as they arrived, they began working with Nemus to requisition ships from various states and to prepare those they already possessed for battle. Meanwhile, Phormio sent word to Athens about the Peloponnesians' preparations and his own victory, requesting as many ships as possible be sent to him quickly, as he expected battle daily. 20 ships were consequently dispatched, but their commander was instructed to first go to Crete. Nicias, a Cretan from Gordes, who was an Athenian proxenus, a public guest friend, had persuaded them to sail against Cydonia, promising to secure the surrender of that hostile town. His true desire was to assist the Polyknitans, neighbors of the Sidonians. He accordingly sailed with the ships to Crete and, accompanied by the Polyknitans, laid waste the lands of the Sidonians. Between adverse winds and severe weather, he wasted no little time there. While the Athenians were thus delayed in Crete, the Peloponnesians in Cyllene prepared for battle and sailed along the coast to Panormus in Achaea, where their land army had arrived to support them. Phormio also sailed along to Malicrian Rhium and anchored outside it with his 20 ships, the same ones he had fought with before. This Rhium was allied with the Athenians. The other Rhium, in the Peloponnese, lies opposite it. The sea between them is about 3/4 of a mile wide and forms the mouth of the Crissaean Gulf. At this Achaean Rhium, not far from Panormus, where their army lay, the Peloponnesians now cast anchor with 77 ships when they saw the Athenians do so. For 6 or 7 days, they remained opposite each other, practicing and preparing for battle. The Peloponnesians were resolved not to sail out of the Rhea into the open sea, fearing the disaster that had already befallen them. The Athenians, on the other hand, chose not to sail into the straits, believing it would be advantageous to the enemy to fight in such confined waters. At last, Nemus, Brasidas, and the other Peloponnesian commanders, eager to bring on a battle as soon as possible before Athenian reinforcements arrived, and noticing that most of their men were disheartened by the previous defeat and lacking morale, first called them together and encouraged them as follows. Peloponnesians, the recent engagement, which may have made some of you afraid of the one now in prospect, really gives no just ground for apprehension. As you know, there was little enough preparation for it, and the object of our voyage was not so much to fight at sea as an expedition by land. Besides this, the chances of war were largely against us, and perhaps inexperience also contributed to our failure in our first naval action. Therefore, it was not cowardice that produced our defeat, nor ought the determination which force has not quelled, but which still has a word to say with its adversary, lose its edge from the result of an accident. Rather, admitting the possibility of a chance mishap, we should know that brave hearts must always be brave, and while they remain so, they can never put forward an experience as an excuse for misconduct. Nor are you so far behind the enemy in experience as you are ahead of him in courage. And although the science of your opponents, if valor accompanied it, would also possess the presence of mind to execute in an emergency the lesson it has learned, yet a faint heart will render all art powerless in the face of danger. For fear takes away the presence of mind, and without valor, art is useless. Against their superior experience, set your superior daring, and against the fear induced by defeat, the fact that you were then unprepared. Remember, too, that you always have the advantage of superior numbers and of engaging off your own coast, supported by your heavy infantry. As a rule, numbers and equipment give victory. At no point, therefore, is defeat likely. As for our previous mistakes, the very fact of their occurrence will teach us better for the future. Steersmen and sailors may, therefore, confidently attend to their several duties, none quitting the station assigned to them. As for ourselves, we promise to prepare for the engagement at least as well as your previous commanders, and to give no excuse for anyone misbehaving. Should any insist on doing so, he shall meet with the punishment he deserves, while the brave shall be honored with the appropriate rewards of valor. The Peloponnesian commanders encouraged their men in this fashion. Phormio, meanwhile, was not without fears for the courage of his own men. Noticing that they were forming groups among themselves and were alarmed by the odds against them, he decided to call them together and instill confidence and counsel in the present emergency. He had repeatedly told them before, and had accustomed their minds to the idea that there was no numerical superiority they could not face. The men themselves had long been persuaded that Athenians need never retreat before any number of Peloponnesian vessels. At this moment, however, he saw that they were dispirited by the sight before them, and wishing to refresh their confidence, called them together and spoke as follows. I see, my men, that you are frightened by the number of the enemy, and I have accordingly called you together, not liking you to be afraid of what is not truly terrible. In the first place, the Peloponnesians, already defeated, and not even themselves believing they are a match for us, have not ventured to meet us on equal terms, but have equipped this multitude of ships against us. Next, regarding that upon which they most rely, the courage they suppose to be innate, their confidence here arises only from the success that their experience in land service usually gives them, which they imagine will serve them just as well at sea. But this advantage will, in all fairness, belong to us on this element, if it belongs to them on land. For they are not superior to us in courage, but we are each more confident, according to our experience in our particular department. Besides, as the Lacedaemonians use their supremacy over their allies to promote their own glory, most of them are being brought into danger against their will. Otherwise, they would never, after such a decisive defeat, have ventured upon a fresh engagement. You need not, therefore, be afraid of their eagerness. You, on the contrary, inspire a much greater and better founded alarm, both because of your recent victory and also their belief that we would not face them unless we were about to achieve something worthy of such a signal success. An adversary numerically superior, like the one before us, enters action trusting more to strength than to resolution, while he who voluntarily confronts tremendous odds must have very great internal resources to draw upon. For these reasons, the Peloponnesians fear our irrational audacity more than they would ever have feared a more proportionate preparation. Furthermore, many armaments have before now succumbed to an inferior force through lack of skill or sometimes lack of courage, neither of which defects are certainly ours. As to the battle, it shall not be, if I can help it, in the strait, nor will I sail in there at all. For in a contest between a number of clumsily managed vessels and a small, fast, well-handled squadron, lack of sea room is an undoubted disadvantage. One cannot properly run down an enemy without having a sight of him a good way off, nor can one retire at need when pressed. One can neither break the line nor return upon his rear, the proper tactics for a fast sailor. Instead, the naval action necessarily becomes a land one, in which numbers must decide the matter. For all this, I will provide as far as I can. Do you stay at your post by your ships and be sharp at catching the word of command, especially as we are observing one another from such a short distance. In action, consider order and silence all important, qualities useful in war generally, and in naval engagements in particular. Behave before the enemy in a manner worthy of your past exploits. The issues you will fight for are great, to destroy the naval hopes of the Peloponnesians, or to bring nearer to the Athenians their fears for the sea. And I may once more remind you that you have defeated most of them already, and beaten men do not face danger twice with the same determination. Such was Phormio's exhortation. The Peloponnesians, realizing the Athenians would not sail into the Gulf and Narrows, decided to lure them in whether they wished for it or not. At dawn, they put out to sea, forming four abreast, and sailed inside the Gulf towards their own country, with their right wing leading, just as they had lain at anchor. In this wing were placed 20 of their best sailing ships. Their hope was that if Phormio thought their objective was Naupactus and sailed along the coast to defend the place, the Athenians would be unable to escape their onset by getting outside their wing, but would be cut off by these vessels. As expected, Phormio, alarmed for Naupactus, which was at that moment without a garrison, reluctantly and hurriedly embarked as soon as he saw them put out. He sailed along the shore, with the Messenian land forces moving alongside to support him. The Peloponnesians, seeing him coasting along with his ships in single file, thus positioning himself inside the Gulf and close to shore as they so desired, gave a single signal. They suddenly tacked and bore down in a line at their best speed on the Athenians, hoping to cut off the entire squadron. However, the 11 leading Athenian vessels escaped the Peloponnesian wing and its sudden movement, reaching the more open water. But the rest were overtaken as they tried to break through, driven ashore, and disabled. Those of the crews who had not swum out were slain. Some of the ships the Peloponnesians lashed to their own and towed off empty. One they captured with the men still on board. Others were just being towed off when they were saved by the Messenians, who dashed into the sea in their armor and fought from the decks of the boarded ships. Thus far, victory was with the Peloponnesians, and the Athenian fleet seemed destroyed. Meanwhile, the 20 ships in the Peloponnesian right wing were chasing the 11 Athenian vessels that had escaped their sudden maneuver and reached open water. These, with the exception of one ship, all outsailed their pursuers and arrived safely in Naupactus. There, forming close to shore opposite the temple of Apollo, with their prows facing the enemy, they prepared to defend themselves in case the Peloponnesians sailed inshore against them. After a while, the Peloponnesians approached, chanting the paean for their victory as they sailed on. The single remaining Athenian ship was being chased by a Leucadian vessel, far ahead of the rest. But there happened to be a merchantman lying at anchor in the roadstead. The Athenian ship found time to sail around it, striking the pursuing Leucadian amidships and sinking her. This sudden and unexpected exploit caused a panic among the Peloponnesians. Having fallen out of order in the excitement of victory, some dropped their oars and stopped their way to let the main body catch up, an unsafe thing to do considering how near they were to the enemy's prows. Others ran aground in the shallows, due to their ignorance of the local geography. Elated by this incident, the Athenians gave a cheer in unison and dashed at the enemy, who, embarrassed by their mistakes and the disorder in which they found themselves, stood for only an instant before fleeing to Panormus from where they had set out. The Athenians, following on their heels, captured the 6 nearest vessels and recovered their own ships that had been disabled close to shore and taken in tow at the beginning of the action. They killed some of the crews and took some prisoners. On board the Leucadian ship that sank off the merchantman was the Lacedaemonian Timocrates, who killed himself when the ship went down and was later washed up in the harbor of Naupactus. On their return, the Athenians set up a trophy on the spot from which they had launched and turned the tide of battle. Picking up the wrecks and dead that were on their shore, they returned the enemy's dead under truce. The Peloponnesians also set up a trophy as victors for the defeat inflicted upon the ships they had disabled inshore and dedicated the vessel they had captured at Achaean Rhium, placed alongside their trophy. After this, apprehensive of the reinforcement expected from Athens, all except the Leucadians sailed into the Crissaean Gulf for Corinth. Not long after their retreat, the 20 Athenian ships, which were meant to have joined Phormio before the battle, arrived at Naupactus. Thus the summer ended. Winter was now at hand, but instead of dispersing the fleet, which had retired to Corinth and the Crissaean Gulf, Nemus, Brasidas, and the other Peloponnesian captains allowed themselves to be persuaded by the Megarians to attempt an attack on Piraeus, the port of Athens. Because of Athens' decisive superiority at sea, Piraeus had naturally been left unguarded and open. Their plan was as follows. The men were each to take their oar, cushion, and rowlock strap, and traveling overland from Corinth to the sea on the Athenian side, to get to Megara as quickly as they could. There, they would launch 40 vessels, which happened to be in the docks at Nicaea, and immediately sail to Piraeus. There was no fleet on the lookout in the harbor, and no one had the slightest idea of the enemy attempting a surprise attack. It was thought that an open attack would never be deliberately ventured, or if contemplated, would be quickly known in Athens. Their plan formed. The next step was to execute it. Arriving by night and launching the vessels from Nicaea, they sailed not to Piraeus, as they had originally intended, being afraid of the risk. Besides, there was some talk of a wind having stopped them, but to the point of Salamis that faces Megara. There, they found a fort and a squadron of 3 ships guarding against anything sailing in or out of Megara. This fort they assaulted, towed off the galleys empty, and, surprising the inhabitants, began to lay waste the rest of the island. Meanwhile, fire signals were raised to alarm Athens, and a panic ensued there as serious as any that occurred during the war. The belief in the city was that the enemy had already sailed into Piraeus. In Piraeus, it was thought that they had taken Salamis and might arrive in the port at any moment, as indeed might easily have been done if their hearts had been a little firmer. Certainly no wind would have prevented them. As soon as day broke, the Athenians assembled in full force, launched their ships, and embarking in haste and uproar, went with the fleet to Salamis, while their soldiers mounted guard in Piraeus. The Peloponnesians, upon becoming aware of the approaching relief, after having overrun most of Salamis, hastily sailed off with their plunder, captives, and the 3 ships from Fort Budorum to Nicaea. The condition of their ships also caused them some anxiety, as it had been a long while since they had been launched, and they were not watertight. Arriving at Megara, they returned back on foot to Corinth. The Athenians, finding them no longer at Salamis, sailed back themselves, and after this, made arrangements for guarding Piraeus more diligently in the future by closing the harbors and by other suitable precautions. About the same time, at the beginning of this winter, Cydalus, son of Teres, the Odrysian king of Thrace, launched an expedition against Perdiccas, son of Alexander, king of Macedonia, and the Chalcidians in the vicinity of Thrace. His objective was to enforce one promise and fulfill another. On the one hand, Perdiccas had made him a promise, when hard-pressed at the commencement of the war, on condition that Sidelces would reconcile the Athenians to him and not attempt to restore his brother and enemy, the pretender Philip. However, Perdiccas had not offered to fulfill his engagement. On the other hand, Sidelces, upon entering into an alliance with the Athenians, had agreed to put an end to the Chalcidian War in Thrace. These were the two objects of his invasion. With him, he brought Amyntas, the son of Philip, whom he intended for the throne of Macedonia, along with some Athenian envoys then at his court for this business, and Hagnon as general. For the Athenians were to join him against the Chalcidians with a fleet and as many soldiers as they could muster. Beginning with the Odrysians, he first called out the Thracian tribes subject to him between Mounts Haemus and Rhodope, and the Euxine Sea and Hellespont. Next, the Gedi beyond Haemus, and the other hordes settled south of the Danube in the vicinity of the Euxine, who, like the Gedi, bordered on the Scythians and were armed in the same manner, all being mounted archers. Besides these, he summoned many of the independent hill Thracian swordsmen, called Dii, and mostly inhabiting Mount Rhodope, some of whom came as mercenaries, others as volunteers. He also called upon the Agrians and Leons and the rest of the Paeonian tribes within his empire, at whose confines these lay, extending up to the Leon Paeonians and the Strymon River, which flows from Mount Scombrus through the country of the Agrians and Leons. There, the empire of Sidelces ended, and the territory of the independent Paeonians began. Bordering on the Triballi, also independent, were the Traeres and Tilitians, who dwelt to the north of Mount Scombrus and extended toward the setting sun as far as the Oscius River. This river rises in the same mountains as the Nestus and Hebrus, a wild and extensive range connected with Rhodope. The empire of the Odrysians extended along the seaboard from Abdera to the mouth of the Danube in the Euxine Sea. The shortest navigation of this coast by a merchantman takes 4 days and 4 nights with a tailwind the entire way. By land, an active man, traveling by the shortest road, can get from Abdera to the Danube in 11 days. Such was the length of its coastline. Inland, from Byzantium to the Leons and the Strymon, the farthest limit of its extension into the interior, it is a journey of 13 days for an active man. The tribute from all the barbarian districts and the Hellenic cities, taking what they brought in under Sueus, the successor of Sidelces, who raised it to its greatest height, amounted to about 400 talents in gold and silver. There were also presents in gold and silver of no less an amount, besides cloth, plain and embroidered, and other articles, made not only for the king, but also for the Odrysian lords and nobles. For there was here established a custom opposite to that prevailing in the Persian kingdom, namely, of taking rather than giving. More disgrace was attached to not giving when asked than to asking and being refused. And although this prevailed elsewhere in Thrace, it was practiced most extensively among the powerful Odrysians, it being impossible to get anything done without a present. It was thus a very powerful kingdom, in revenue and general prosperity surpassing all in Europe between the Ionian Gulf and the Euxine. In numbers and military resources, it came decidedly next to the Scythians, with whom indeed no people in Europe can bear comparison, there not being even in Asia any nation singly a match for them, if unanimous, though of course they are not on a level with other races in general intelligence and the arts of civilized life. It was the master of this empire that now prepared to take the field. When everything was ready, he set out on his march for Macedonia, first through his own dominions, then over the desolate range of Cercin that divides the Sinians and Paeonians. He crossed by a road he had made by felling timber on a previous campaign against the latter people. Passing over these mountains, with the Paeonians on his right and the Sinians and Medians on his left, he finally arrived at Doberus in Paeonia. He lost none of his army on the march, except perhaps by sickness, but received some augmentations as many of the independent Thracians volunteered to join him in the hope of plunder. so that the whole is said to have formed a grand total of 150,000. Most of this was infantry, though there was about a third cavalry, furnished principally by the Odrysians themselves and next to them by the Geti. The most warlike of the infantry were the independent swordsmen who came down from Rhodope. The rest of the mixed multitude that followed him were chiefly formidable by their sheer numbers. Assembling in Doberus, they prepared to descend from the heights into Lower Macedonia, where the dominions of Perdiccas lay. For the Lyncesti, Elymiots, and other more inland tribes, though Macedonian by blood and allies and dependents of their kin, still maintained their own separate governments. The country on the seacoast, now called Macedonia, was first acquired by Alexander, the father of Perdiccas, and his ancestors, originally Temenids from Argos. This was achieved by expelling the Pyrians from Pieria, who later inhabited Phagars and other places under Mount Pangaeus, beyond the Strymon. Indeed, the country between Pangaeus and the sea is still called the Pyrian Gulf. By expelling the Bottiaeans, now neighbors of the Chalcidians, from Bottia, and by acquiring a narrow strip in Paeonia along the Axius River, extending to Pella and the sea. The district of Mygdonia, between the Axius and the Strymon, was also added by expelling the Edonians. From Euodia, the Eordians were also driven out, most of whom perished, though a few still live around Fisca, as were the Almopians from Almopia. These Macedonians also conquered places belonging to other tribes, which are still theirs: Anthemus, Crestonia, Bisaltia, and much of Macedonia proper. The whole is now called Macedonia, and at the time of Cydalus' invasion, Perdiccas, Alexander's son, was the reigning king. These Macedonians, unable to take the field against so numerous invaders, shut themselves up in such strong places and fortresses as the country possessed. Of these, there was no great number. Most of those now found in the country had been erected subsequently by Archelaus, the son of Perdiccas, upon his accession, who also cut straight roads and otherwise put the kingdom on a better footing regarding horses, heavy infantry, and other war material than had been done by all the 8 kings that preceded him. Advancing from Doberus, the Thracian host first invaded what had once been Philip's territory and took Idumene by assault, while Gortynia, Atlanta, and some other places were gained by negotiation. These last came over due to their loyalty to Philip's son, Amyntas, who was then with Cydalus. Laying siege to Euripus and failing to take it, Cydalus next advanced into the rest of Macedonia, to the left of Pella and Cyrrhus, not proceeding beyond this in Abadia and Pieria, but staying to lay waste Mygdonia, Crestonia, and Anthemus. The Macedonians never even considered meeting him with infantry. However, the Thracian host was, as opportunity offered, attacked by small groups of Macedonian cavalry, which had been reinforced by their allies in the interior. Armed with cuirasses and excellent horsemen, wherever these charged, they overthrew all before them, but ran considerable risk in entangling themselves in the masses of the enemy. So, they finally desisted from these efforts, deciding that they were not strong enough to venture against such superior numbers. Meanwhile, Cydalus opened negotiations with Perdiccas regarding the objectives of his expedition. Finding that the Athenians, not believing he would come, did not appear with their fleet, although they sent presents and envoys, Cydalus dispatched a large part of his army against the Chalcidians and Bottiaeans. He shut them up inside their walls and laid waste to their country. While he remained in these parts, the people farther south, such as the Thessalians, Magnates, and the other tribes subject to the Thessalians, and the Hellenes as far as Thermopylae, all feared that the army might advance against them and prepared accordingly. These fears were shared by the Thracians beyond the Strymon to the north, who inhabited the plains, such as the Paeanians, the Odomanti, the Droi, and the Dercians, all of whom were independent. It was even a matter of conversation among the Hellenes, who were enemies of Athens, whether he might not be invited by his ally to advance also against them. Meanwhile, he held Chalcidice Bottice and Macedonia, and was ravaging them all. But finding that he was not succeeding in any of the objectives of his invasion, and that his army was without provisions and suffering from the severity of the season, he listened to the advice of Sueus, son of Spartacus, his nephew and highest officer, and decided to retreat without delay. This Sueus had been secretly won over by Perdiccas with the promise of his sister in marriage with a rich dowry. In accordance with this advice, and after a stay of 30 days in all, 8 of which were spent in Chalcidice, he retired home as quickly as he could. Perdiccas afterwards gave his sister Stratonice to Sueus as he had promised. Such was the history of the expedition of Sitalces. In the course of this winter, after the dispersion of the Peloponnesian fleet, the Athenians in Naupactus, under Phormio, sailed along to Astacus and disembarked. They marched into the interior of Acarnania with 400 Athenian heavy infantry and 400 Messenians. After expelling some suspected persons from Stratus, Coronta, and other places, and restoring Signs, son of Theolytus, to Coronta, they returned to their ships. They decided that it was impossible in the winter season to march against Eniade, a place which, unlike the rest of Acarnania, had always been hostile to them. For the Achilles River, flowing from Mount Pindus through Dolopia and the country of the Agrians and Amphilochians and the plain of Acarnania, past the town of Stratus in the upper part of its course, forms lakes where it falls into the sea around Eniade, and thus makes it impracticable for an army in winter due to the water. Opposite Eniade lie most of the islands called Echinides, so close to the mouths of the Achilles that powerful stream is constantly forming deposits against them. It has already joined some of the islands to the continent, and seems likely in no long while to do the same with the rest. For the current is strong, deep, and turbid, and the islands are so thick together that they serve to imprison the alluvial deposit and prevent its dispersing, lying, as they do, not in one line, but irregularly, so as to leave no direct passage for the water into the open sea. The islands in question are uninhabited and of no great size. There is also a story that Alcmaeon, son of Amphiaraus, during his wanderings after the murder of his mother, was bidden by Apollo to inhabit this spot through an oracle, which intimated that he would have no release from his terrors until he should find a country to dwell in which had not been seen by the sun, or existed as land, at the time he slew his mother, all else being to him polluted ground. Perplexed at this, the story goes on to say, he at last observed this deposit of the Achilles, and considered that a place sufficient to support life upon might have been thrown up during the long interval that had elapsed since the death of his mother and the beginning of his wanderings. Settling, therefore, in the district around Eniade, he founded a dominion and left the country its name from his son Acarnan. Such is the story we have received concerning Alcmaeon. The Athenians and Phormio, returning from Acarnania and arriving at Naupactus, sailed home to Athens in the spring, taking with them the ships they had captured and such of the prisoners made in the late actions as were freemen, who were exchanged, man for man. And so ended this winter, and the 3rd year of this war, of which Thucydides was the historian.